Hey there, welcome to my channel. I just started this channel, and your support means the world to me. It helps me keep sharing the stories I love. This video is completely ad-free and designed to help you fall asleep fast and comfortably. Like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of stories I share here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to feel connected with all of you. Now, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like, and let's drift into tonight's stories together. Story 1. My daughter's imaginary friend knows too much about our past. The first time Lily mentioned peaches, it was a sun-drenched Tuesday in June. Sunlight, thick and golden as honey, poured through the bay window of our new living room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, blissful spirits. My wife, Sarah, was unpacking a box of books, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to decide where the Dickens collection should go. I was on the floor struggling with the notoriously vague instructions for a Swedish-designed bookshelf. Lily, all of 5 years old with hair the color of spun corn silk and eyes the deep, serious blue of a twilight sky, was having a tea party on the Persian rug we'd bought as a celebratory splurge for the new house. Her guests were a one-eyed teddy bear named Barnaby and a perpetually smiling rag doll called Daisy, and apparently a new addition. "No, Peaches, you can't have more sugar," she said, her voice a stern, motherly whisper. "It's bad for your teeth." I glanced over at her, a smile tugging at my lips. "Who are you talking to, Sweet Pea?" "Peaches," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She carefully poured a drop of imaginary tea into an empty spot on the rug. "He's very greedy." Sarah looked up from her books, her face softening into the kind of warm, maternal smile that had made me fall in love with her a decade ago. "Oh, we have a new friend? What does Peaches look like?" Lily tilted her head, considering the question with the gravity of a seasoned philosopher. "He's long," she said finally, "and he wears patchy clothes, like a scarecrow. And he's sad, I think. His face is all smudgy. An imaginary friend. The parenting books we'd devoured had told us to expect this. It was a normal, healthy part of a child's development, a sign of a vibrant imagination. We smiled at each other over Lily's head, a silent, shared moment of parental pride. Our little girl was creative. She was bright. She was normal. After everything we had been through, normal was the most beautiful word in the English language. We'd bought this house to be our fortress of normal. It was a 2-story colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street in a town where nobody knew our names. It was a deliberate, calculated escape from the city, from the ghosts of our old life, from the constant low-level hum of anxiety that had become the soundtrack to our marriage. This house, with its fresh coat of dove-gray paint and its sprawling backyard, was meant to be a new beginning, a place where the past couldn't find us. For a few weeks it was. Peaches became a fixture in our home. An extra, invisible place was set at the dinner table. Lily would leave the bathroom door ajar so Peaches could get out. She would tell us stories about him, strange, disjointed narratives. "Peaches lived in the walls," she said. "He used to live in a dark, wet place. He was always cold." We'd nod and smile, playing along, marveling at the intricate world she was building. The detail about him being smudgy and sad was a little melancholic, maybe, but kids have a flair for the dramatic. We wrote it off as a harmless quirk, the first tremor, the first sign that the foundations of our new, normal life were built on something deeply unstable came on a rainy Saturday. We were supposed to go to the town's Founders' Day picnic, but a sudden thunderstorm had trapped us indoors. I was trying to teach Lily how to play checkers, and she was, as usual, making up her own far more interesting rules. "Daddy," she said, moving one of my red checkers diagonally and then taking it off the board. "King me." "That's not how it works, sweetie," I laughed. "You have to get to my side of the board first." She looked down at the board, her little brow crinkled. Then she looked up at me, her blue eyes eerily focused. "Peaches says you don't like to play by the rules either." My hand, which had been hovering over the board, froze. A faint, cold prickle ran up my spine. "What do you mean, honey?" "He says you took a shortcut once," she continued, her voice a perfect mimicry of innocent conversation. "On the old road, the one with all the rocks. You were in a hurry." She pushed another one of my checkers off the board. "You were going very, very fast." The air in the room suddenly felt thin and sharp. The sound of the rain against the windows faded to a dull roar in my ears. The old road, the one with all the rocks, the old quarry road. It had been 7 years, but the memory was branded onto the inside of my skull. A dark, winding ribbon of asphalt, slick with rain, hemmed in by woods on one side and a sheer drop on the other. A shortcut we should never have taken. I forced a laugh. It came out sounding brittle and strange. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lilybug. Peaches has a funny imagination." I looked over at Sarah, who was curled on the sofa with a magazine. She had heard. I could see it in the way her shoulders had tensed, in the way her hands were gripping the magazine so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes met mine, and for a fleeting second I saw it. The same cold, stomach-dropping fear that was currently coursing through my veins. But she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by a practiced, placid neutrality. Later that night, when Lily was asleep, I brought it up. We were in the kitchen, the only light coming from the small lamp over the sink, which cast long, distorted shadows across the room. "What Lily said today," I began, my voice low, "about the quarry road." Sarah didn't look at me. She kept her back to me, scrubbing a pot with a furious circular motion. "She's 5, Tom. She hears things. We probably talked about it when we thought she was asleep. You know how kids are. They're like little sponges." "When have we ever talked about that night?" I demanded, my voice rising. "When? We made a promise, Sarah. We buried it. We never speak of it." "Then it was a coincidence," she said, her voice tight. She turned off the water and placed the pot on the drying rack with a sharp, definitive clatter. A creepy, horrible coincidence, but that's all it was. It has to be. She turned to face me, and her eyes were pleading. She was begging me to believe her, to let her keep the comfortable blanket of denial wrapped around us. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to more than anything. To dismiss it, to rationalize it, to file it away as a creepy but meaningless event. So I nodded. I agreed. For her, for us, for the fragile new life we were trying to build. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the rain and the creaks and groans of our new house, I couldn't shake the image of Lily's serious blue eyes. And I couldn't silence the question that was screaming in the back of my mind. Who the hell was Peaches? The coincidences began to pile up, each one a small, sharp stone added to the growing mountain of my dread. A week later, Sarah came home from the grocery store with a bouquet of yellow roses, her favorite. She put them in a vase on the kitchen table, a bright, cheerful splash of color in the sunlit room. Lily came running in, took one look at them, and her face crumpled. "Peaches doesn't like those," she said, her lower lip trembling. "They were his mommy's favorite. They make him sad." Sarah froze, her hand still on the vase. She looked at me, her face pale. Yellow roses. It was another detail, another piece of the mosaic of that night. The other car, the one that had spun out in front of us, had been a beat-up station wagon. The back was filled with groceries, spilled all over the road, and there had been a bouquet of yellow roses scattered and broken on the wet asphalt, their bright petals bruised and dirt-stained. It was a detail I hadn't even realized I remembered until that very moment. "How could she know that, Tom?" Sarah whispered later, after we'd managed to calm a hysterical Lily down by moving the flowers outside. "How?" "She couldn't," I said, my voice hollow. The rationalizations were getting harder and harder to construct. The coincidences were straining the laws of probability to their breaking point. Peach's presence grew stronger, his descriptions more vivid. He wasn't just long and patchy anymore. According to Lily, his hair was the color of mud. He had a big, ugly cut on his forehead that never went away, and one of his shoes was missing. He was always looking for his other shoe. I started watching Lily obsessively. I'd stand in the hallway just out of sight and listen to her one-sided conversations in her playroom. Her voice would be light and cheerful, but the things she said, the things Peaches was supposedly telling her, were chilling. "No, I can't ask them that, Peaches. That's a secret, because secrets are supposed to be quiet. I don't know why they didn't stop. Maybe they were scared." My blood ran cold. I felt like an insect trapped under glass, being watched by something ancient and malevolent. This thing, this Peaches, wasn't a product of Lily's imagination. It was an intrusion. It was something that had attached itself to her, something that was using her as a mouthpiece to terrorize us. The physical manifestation started subtly. A photograph from our wedding, which sat on the mantelpiece, would be turned face down. A single muddy footprint, too large to be Lily's, would appear on the welcome mat, even when it hadn't rained. The temperature in Lily's room would sometimes drop suddenly, becoming unnaturally cold, making the hairs on my arms stand up. Sarah was trying to hold on to her denial, but it was failing. I could see the terror in her eyes, the dark circles that were forming from sleepless nights. We were becoming ghosts in our own home, speaking in hushed tones, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The silence between us was growing, filled with the unspoken horror of what was happening and the deeper, older horror of what we had done. The night it all shattered, the night we could no longer pretend, started with a song. I was tucking Lily into bed. She was quiet and withdrawn, as she often was now. She was clutching her one-eyed bear, Barnaby, so tightly her knuckles were white. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small, "can you sing me the Crooked Man song?" I frowned. "I don't think I know that one, Sweet Pea." "Yes, you do," she insisted. "Peaches says you know it. It was on the radio, the night of the shortcut." And then she started to hum, a broken, off-key little tune. but it was unmistakable. It was an old folk song, one I hadn't heard in years, but it had been playing on the radio that night. I remembered it with a sickening lurch of my stomach. It had been playing right at the moment of impact. The cheerful, jaunty melody had been a grotesque counterpoint to the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal on metal. My breath hitched in my chest. I couldn't move. I just stared at my daughter, this perfect, innocent little girl who was humming the theme song to the worst moment of my entire life. "He wants you to remember the other man, Daddy," Lily whispered, her eyes wide in the dim light from the hallway. "Peaches says you left him. You left him in the dark, and he was so cold." That was it. That was the moment the floor gave way. I fled the room, stumbling down the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I found Sarah in the living room, standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. She turned as I entered, and she didn't have to ask. She could see it on my face. "Tom," she breathed. "She knows," I choked out, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "She knows everything. The song, the other driver, leaving him there, this thing, it's telling her everything." The dam of our shared silence, 7 years in the making, finally broke. The story, the one we had buried so deep we could almost pretend it never happened, came rushing out. We were 24, young, stupid, and a little drunk from a friend's wedding. I was driving. It was raining, a torrential downpour that made the world outside the windshield a blurry, impressionistic nightmare. Sarah was navigating, and she pointed me down the old quarry road, a shortcut she'd heard about. I was driving too fast, showing off, feeling immortal, in the way only a 24-year-old can. He came out of nowhere, a station wagon pulling out from a hidden side road. I swerved, but it was too late. The impact was a jarring, deafening explosion of sound and light. Our car spun, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of rain and shattered glass before we came to a stop in a ditch. We were alive, bruised, terrified, but alive. The other car was a wreck, crumpled and twisted, its headlights pointing at crazy angles into the woods. And in the sudden, ringing silence that followed the crash, we heard a groan, a single, low sound of pain coming from the other car. Someone was hurt. Someone was alive. And we were drunk. The smell of the spilled champagne was thick in the car. We looked at each other, and in that moment, a silent, terrible decision was made. Panic, cold and absolute, overrode everything else. It overrode decency, compassion, humanity. We were kids. We were scared of the consequences, of the red and blue lights of the jail cells we imagined. So we did the unthinkable. I put the car in reverse. The tires spun in the mud, and then they caught. I backed out of the ditch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. We didn't look back. We just drove. We left the scene. We left a man groaning in the wreckage of his car, alone on a deserted road in the middle of a storm. We got home, showered, and pretended it was a bad dream. The next day, scouring the local news online, my hands trembling, I found a small article, a single-car accident on the old quarry road. The driver, a man named Michael Rafferty, a 45-year-old widower and father of one, had been found dead at the scene by a passing motorist hours later. The article said he'd likely died on impact. We clung to that. We told ourselves that lie over and over again until it became our truth. He died on impact. Nothing we could have done would have saved him. Our leaving didn't make a difference. We sold the car for scrap. We moved out of our apartment a few months later. We started over. We built a new life, a good life. We got married. We had Lily, and we buried the ghost of Michael Rafferty so deep that we almost forgot he existed. But he hadn't forgotten us. He had been waiting, and now he had found us. He was in our house. He was talking to our daughter, and he called himself Peaches. The name had been a mystery, a strange, childish moniker. But now, as I stood in my living room, the full weight of our past crashing down on me, I remembered another detail. From the news article, Michael Rafferty had been on his way home from visiting his mother at a nursing home. Her name was Beatrice, but everyone called her Peaches. He was her only son. The entity in our house wasn't just a random spirit. It was him, Michael Rafferty. And he wanted something. After that night, the haunting escalated from psychological warfare to a full-blown physical assault. The whispers were no longer confined to Lily's room. I would hear them in the static of the television, in the rush of water from the faucet, my name spoken in a dry, rasping whisper. "Tom, you left me. It was so cold." Doors would slam shut in empty hallways. The lights would flicker and die, plunging us into darkness, only to flare back on moments later. One morning, I came downstairs to find every cabinet and drawer in the kitchen hanging open, their contents spilled onto the floor. On the kitchen wall, traced in a thin layer of spilled flour, was a single shaky word. Why? Lily was changing. Our bright, bubbly little girl was becoming a shadow. She stopped playing. She would just sit in her room for hours, staring at the wall, sometimes murmuring to herself. The dark circles under her eyes mirrored our own. She started drawing pictures, disturbing childish scribbles in black and red crayon, a drawing of a stick figure lying next to a mangled car, a drawing of a tall, patchy man with a sad, smudgy face standing at the foot of her bed. We were prisoners. The beautiful house we had bought as our sanctuary had become our jail, and Michael Rafferty was the warden. He was feeding on our fear, on our guilt. We knew we had to do something, but what? We couldn't call the police. We couldn't call a priest. We weren't religious, and it felt like a hollow, desperate gesture. We were alone with the monster we had created. The breaking point, the moment I knew we were in danger of losing not just our sanity but our daughter, came a week later. I was in my home office trying to work, though I couldn't concentrate. The house was quiet, too quiet. A sudden primal instinct, a father's intuition, screamed at me that something was wrong. I ran upstairs to Lily's room. The door was closed. I threw it open. The room was cold, unnaturally so. Lily was standing on a chair, which she had pushed up against the open window. She was leaning out, her small body silhouetted against the gray afternoon sky. "Lily!" I screamed, my voice cracking with terror. She turned, and for a split second, it wasn't her. Her face was slack, her eyes vacant and dark. Her voice, when it came out, was not the high, sweet voice of a 5-year-old. It was a low, rasping whisper, a sound that was both old and full of a terrible, wet-sounding pain. "He wants to show you how it feels," the voice said, coming from my daughter's lips. "How it feels to fall, how it feels to be broken." I lunged across the room, my heart exploding in my chest. I grabbed her around the waist and pulled her back, stumbling, falling to the floor with her in my arms. She started to cry, real terrified sobs this time. The presence was gone. It was just my daughter trembling and weeping in my arms. "Daddy, I was scared," she cried. "Peaches was telling me to jump. He said it would be like flying." I held her, rocking her back and forth, my own body shaking uncontrollably. This was it. He wasn't just trying to scare us anymore. He was trying to take our daughter. He was going to make us feel the same pain he had felt, the pain of losing a child. We had left him to die, and now he was going to take the one thing that made our lives worth living. That night, after Lily was asleep in our bed, barricaded between us, Sarah and I finally faced the truth. "We have to leave Tom," she said, her voice a shattered whisper in the dark. "We have to pack a bag and just go. Leave the house. Leave everything." "And go where?" I asked, my own voice hollow with despair. "Don't you see, Sarah? It's not the house. He's not attached to the house. He's attached to us, to our secret. He'll follow us wherever we go. We can't run from this." "Then what do we do?" she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "What can we possibly do?" I was silent for a long time, the answer forming in my mind, a cold, heavy thing. It was an answer I had been avoiding for 7 years. "We have to tell the truth," I said softly. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "What are you talking about?" "We have to confess," I said, the words tasting like ash. "We have to go to the police. We have to tell them what we did. It's the only way. The secret, the guilt, that's his anchor. It's what's given him his power. If we release it, if we face the consequences, maybe it will set him free, and us." The terror in her eyes was replaced by a different kind of fear, the fear of public shame, of prison, of losing Lily to the system. "Tom, no, we can't. It would destroy our lives. It would destroy Lily's life." "He is destroying Lily's life right now," I retorted, my voice a harsh whisper. "He tried to make her jump out of a window today. What's he going to do tomorrow? We have no choice, Sarah. We either face the justice of the living, or we will be tormented by the justice of the dead for the rest of our lives, and we will lose our daughter in the process." We didn't sleep that night. We just lay there holding each other, with our daughter sleeping between us, the silent, terrible weight of our decision settling over us. As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale, watery shades of gray and pink, we knew what we had to do. But first, there was one more thing. We had to face him, not the police, not yet. We had to face Michael Rafferty. We had to confess to him. We decided to do it in Lily's room. It felt like his territory, the place where he was strongest. We waited until Lily was downstairs watching cartoons, a temporary, fragile truce having settled over the house. We stood in the middle of her room, the childish drawings and colorful toys a bizarre backdrop for what we were about to do. "Michael," I said, my voice shaking. "Michael Rafferty, we know you're here." The room grew cold. A floorboard creaked behind me. The air grew thick and heavy with a palpable sense of sorrow and rage. "We are so sorry," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We were just kids. We were scared. It's not an excuse. There are no excuses. But we were so scared." "We should have stopped," I continued, my own voice thick with unshed tears. "We should have called for help. We should have stayed with you. Maybe we could have saved you. We'll never know. And we have to live with that for the rest of our lives." The temperature dropped further. A little plastic horse on Lily's dresser flew across the room and shattered against the wall. A low moan seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He was listening. "We left you," I said, forcing myself to say the words that had been buried for so long. "We hit you, and we left you to die alone in the dark. It was a cowardly, monstrous thing to do, and we are going to pay for it. Tomorrow, we're going to the police. We're going to confess everything. We're going to tell them what we did to you." The room was silent. The oppressive presence seemed to lessen, the anger replaced by a profound, bottomless well of sadness. "We can't give you back your life," Sarah sobbed. "We can't undo what we did. All we can do is tell the truth and ask you to please, please leave our daughter alone. She's innocent. This is on us, not her. Punish us, but let her go." For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Then, on the wall opposite us, a single word was traced in the condensation that had suddenly formed on the cold surface. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was just one heartbreaking word. Lonely. And then, as quickly as it had come, the cold was gone. The presence, the weight, the feeling of being watched, it all lifted. It was like a pressure valve had been released inside the house, inside my own head. The room was just a little girl's room again. The sun streamed through the window, bright and warm. It was over. The confession, the promise of justice, had been enough. We had finally done the right thing, and it had set us all free. The next day we hired a lawyer and turned ourselves in. The story that followed was a messy public ordeal. It was in the papers, on the local news. We were the monsters who had fled, who had hidden for 7 years. We were judged, and rightly so. But through it all, there was a strange, unexpected sense of relief. The secret was out. The burden we had been carrying for so long was finally lifted. Because of our confession and the years that had passed, the sentence was lighter than it could have been. I served 18 months. Sarah, as a passenger, got 5 years of probation and community service. We lost the house. We lost our savings. We lost our reputation. But we never lost Lily, and the ghost of Michael Rafferty never came back. Lily has no memory of Peaches. To her, he was just an imaginary friend she eventually grew out of. Sometimes, late at night, I think about him, Michael Rafferty. I think about the life we took, the future we stole from him. The justice of the courts feels inadequate for what we did. My true sentence is the one I serve every day, the memory of his name whispered in the dark, the image of that single, sad word traced on the wall. We buried a secret, and in doing so, we buried our own souls. It took the haunting of our daughter to finally dig them back up. We live with the scars. We have to. It's the price we pay for being the people who drove away, leaving a good man to die alone on a dark, rocky road, with only the sound of a crooked man singing on the radio for company. The house was a gift from a ghost. Not a literal one, of course, but the ghost of a life I was supposed to have lived. It had been bought by my husband, Michael, a man who had loved the solid, tangible things of the world, the heft of an old book, the grain of reclaimed timber, the satisfying click of a well-made lock. He had bought it 3 weeks before a slick of black ice on a mountain road had turned our shared future into a singular, desolate present. He had seen the house, an old forgotten Victorian dowager on a cliff overlooking the sea, and had declared it the place where we would grow old, a beautiful, sprawling repository for our future memories. I, a forensic sketch artist, A man who made his living by giving faces to the faceless was left to inherit a future I no longer had a partner for. My name is Elias Vance. For the first 6 months after the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to even visit the house. It sat empty, a monument to a future that had been canceled. But the lease on my city apartment was ending, and the thought of finding a new sterile space, a place untouched by Michael's memory, was somehow more painful than confronting the one he had chosen for us. So I packed my life into a series of sad brown cardboard boxes and moved to the ghost house. It was beautiful in a sad, neglected way. The salt-laced wind had scoured the paint from the cedar shingles, leaving the wood a soft, silvery gray. The rooms were large and airy, with high ceilings and tall, multi-paned windows that were perpetually fogged with a thin, greasy layer of sea mist. The house was a project, and I, a man with nothing but time and a grief so profound it felt like a full-time job, needed a project. The face appeared in the plaster. It was in the master bedroom, a vast, cold room on the second floor with a panoramic view of the churning gray Atlantic. A leak in the roof, probably decades old, had left a sprawling, complex water stain on the wall opposite the bed. It was a chaotic, organic map of brown and yellow continents on a sea of peeling ecru-colored paint. And in the heart of that map, I began to see it. At first, it was just pareidolia, the mind's desperate innate need to find patterns in chaos. As a forensic artist, I was more susceptible to it than most. My brain was professionally trained to see the ghost of a face in the vaguest of shapes, to find a hint of a jawline in a shadow, the suggestion of an eye socket in a blur. I would lie in bed in the profound oceanic silence of the house, and I would watch the shifting light of the moon play across the stain, and I would see the face. It was a man's face, gaunt and long, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. It was a face from a forgotten photograph, a tin-type ghost. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a symptom of a mind that was raw and tired and lonely. I decided to paint the room, to exorcise the stain and its phantom inhabitant with a clean, sterile coat of decorator's white. I spent a full day prepping the walls, scraping away the peeling paint, patching the cracks. The old plaster was a strange, fibrous, and almost organic thing, mixed with what looked like horsehair, a common building material from the era. As I worked, I felt a strange, almost imperceptible coolness emanating from the stained section of the wall, a pocket of cellar-cold air in the otherwise mild room. The next day, I applied the first coat of paint. The thick white primer covered the stain completely, leaving a blank, uniform, and blessedly featureless surface. I felt a sense of profound, almost cleansing relief. I had erased the ghost. I had imposed order on the chaos. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months, but when I woke up in the gray pre-dawn light, I saw that the stain had returned. It had bled through the fresh, thick coat of primer, a faint, brownish watermark that was impossibly more detailed, more defined than before. And the face was no longer a vague suggestion. It was a portrait. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. The features were clear now, the long, straight nose, the thin, unsmiling lips, the hollows of the cheeks, and the eyes. The eyes were the most terrifying part. They were just two dark, almond-shaped smudges, but they were looking directly at me. They were not the blank, empty eyes of a painting. They were the focused, intelligent, and deeply, profoundly, anciently sad eyes of a conscious observer. My rational mind, a sputtering, dying engine, tried to offer up a scientific explanation, a chemical reaction. The specific mineral content of the water in the plaster reacting with the latex in the paint. It was a plausible, if unlikely, theory. But it did not explain the eyes. It did not explain the chilling and deeply personal feeling of being watched. I refused to be driven from my own bedroom. I was a man of science, of logic. I was a man who drew lines, who defined the world in shades of graphite and charcoal. This was just a problem of chemistry and perception. But the face continued to evolve. Each morning it was a little clearer, a little more detailed. The faint suggestion of an earlobe appeared, the subtle, incised line of a wrinkle at a corner of an eye. It was as if a photograph was slowly, agonizingly developing in the very substance of my wall. My professional curiosity, a thing I had thought long dead, began to stir, a morbid and perhaps self-destructive counterpoint to my growing terror. I began to sketch it. I would sit on a stool at the foot of my bed, my large leather-bound sketchbook in my lap, and I would draw the face in the wall. It was a strange and deeply unsettling reversal of my usual work. I was not drawing a face from the fragmented emotional memories of a traumatized victim. I was drawing a face that was itself a memory, trapped in the plaster of my home. The act of drawing it was an act of intimacy. I came to know its every contour, its every subtle, melancholic detail. It was a handsome face in a severe, old-world way, a face that had known suffering. As I drew, the cool spot on the wall seemed to grow, to push out into the room, a palpable, invisible column of frigid air. My nights became a ritual of surveillance. I would lie in bed, my eyes fixed on the face, which was now so clear it was like looking at a faded, sepia-toned photograph. And I began to notice a new and infinitely more terrifying phenomenon. It was changing, not its features, but its expression. One night, the thin, straight line of its lips seemed to curve just slightly at the corners into a faint and deeply unsettling smile. Another night, the dark, smudged eyes seemed to widen just for a fraction of a second, as if in surprise. I was not just observing a static image. I was interacting with a responsive and sentient entity. I had to know who he was. My investigation became an obsession, a frantic, desperate dive into the history of the house, of the land it was built on. I spent my days in the dusty, silent archives of the local historical society, a man haunted not just by a ghost, but by a need for a name. The house had been built in 1888 by a man named Dr. Alastair Finch. The name sent a jolt of recognition through me. Finch. There was a wing at the city's main teaching hospital named after him. He was a pioneering anatomist, a brilliant and notoriously reclusive figure from the city's early history. He had built the house as a private retreat, a place to conduct his research far from the prying eyes of the academic world. The records were sparse. He had lived in a house alone, save for a single, taciturn housekeeper. He had no wife, no children. He was known for his obsessive, and some said morbid, dedication to his work. And then, in the winter of 1903, he had simply vanished. The housekeeper had arrived one morning to find the house empty. The doors were locked from the inside. Nothing was out of place. Dr. Finch's coat was on its hook, his half-finished breakfast on the table. He was just gone. The police had searched for months. They had dragged the sea. They had scoured the woods. They had found nothing. Alistair Finch had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. I found a single, grainy photograph of him in an old medical journal. I held the journal in my trembling hands, my breath catching in my throat. It was him. The same long, gaunt face, the same high cheekbones, the same deep-set, sad, and intelligent eyes. The face in my wall was the face of Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who had disappeared from this very house over a century ago. The rational scientific explanations were now a distant, laughable memory. I was living in a haunted house, but it was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It was not the spirit of a dead man. It was the spirit of a man who had never been found, a man who was perhaps not dead at all, a man who was somewhere else, somewhere inside my walls. My great-uncle Henry's journals from the previous story about the mirror came to mind, not ghosts, but echoes. My research into Dr. Finch led me down a darker, more esoteric path. He had not just been an anatomist. His later work, which had been dismissed by the medical community as the ravings of an eccentric, had been focused on what he called cellular memory. He believed that the human body was not just a machine of flesh and blood, but a vessel for a kind of energetic residue. He believed that a powerful, focused consciousness could, at the moment of extreme duress or concentration, leave an imprint of itself on its surrounding environment, an echo, a psychic photograph, and I found his formula. In a letter to a colleague, a letter in which he was clearly trying to secure funding for his increasingly strange research, he had described a new experimental plaster he had developed, a plaster that was not mixed with horsehair and sand, but with a fine, powdered, and deeply unsettling mixture of human bone ash and silver nitrate. He claimed it was the perfect medium, a kind of psychic film, capable of capturing the final, desperate, energetic imprint of a human soul. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to sit down. My walls were not just walls. They were a tomb, a recording medium. And the face of Dr. Finch was not a stain. It was a photograph, taken from the inside. He had not vanished. He had imprinted himself. He had become a part of the house. The phenomena began to escalate, to bleed out from the wall and into the room itself. I would hear a soft, dry, whispering sound at night, like the sound of a page being turned in an old, brittle book. I would wake up to find the objects on my bedside table rearranged, my sketchbook moved to the other side of the room. One morning, I found a single, perfect, and deeply disturbing handprint in the thick layer of dust on the floorboards in front of the wall. It was a long, slender hand, the hand of an academic, a surgeon, and it was as if someone had pressed their hand to the floor from the inside of the wall and the dust had settled around it. He was no longer just watching me, he was trying to reach me. And then the face began to change in a new and far more terrifying way. It began to look like me. It was a slow, subtle, and horrifying transformation. The line of the jaw would soften just slightly to match my own. The shape of the eyes would change, becoming a little wider, a little less deep-set. The thin, straight lips would become a little fuller. It was as if he was studying me, my own face, my own features, and he was incorporating them. He was using my own reflection, my own presence as a model, a template. He was overriding his own faded image with my fresh, living one. I was no longer just an observer of this phenomenon. I was a participant. I was the source material. He was not just a ghost in my house. He was a parasite, and he was feeding on my own identity. I had to get out. The thought was a primal, screaming imperative. I packed a bag, my hands shaking, my eyes darting nervously towards the wall, where the face, now a grotesque, androgynous fusion of my own features and his, watched me with a calm and deeply unsettling curiosity. I went to the front door, my hand on the knob, and the door would not open. The old, heavy and well-made lock was frozen solid. I tried the back door. The same. The windows, the old sash-cord windows that had been painted shut for decades, were now as solid and immovable as the stone foundation of the house itself. I was trapped. The house, his body, would not let me leave. I was a prisoner in a house that was actively and intelligently trying to consume me. My last desperate hope was my sister, Sarah. She was a journalist, a hard-headed, cynical, and deeply practical woman who had always viewed my artistic temperament with a kind of affectionate pity. She was the only person I had told about the house, and she had, of course, assumed my strange behavior was just an eccentric and slightly morbid manifestation of my grief. She had promised to drive up from the city at the end of the week to check on me. I had my phone. I had a signal. I called her. My voice was a frantic, terrified mess. I told her I was trapped. I told her the house wouldn't let me out. She was silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. I could hear the deep, weary sigh of a woman who was convinced her brother had finally and completely lost his mind. "Okay, Elias," she said, her voice the calm, placating tone one uses with a frightened child or a lunatic. "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll leave right now. It will take me about 3 hours. Just try to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" 3 hours. It felt like a lifetime. I spent those 3 hours in a state of high-alert, paranoid terror. I barricaded myself in the living room, as far away from the bedroom, from the wall, as I could get. The whispering was louder now, a constant, sibilant, and almost conversational murmur that was coming from all the walls at once. And in the whispering, I could hear my own name, Elias. And then the wall in the living room, the one that faced the sea, the one where Michael and I had planned to hang his favorite oversized abstract painting, began to change. The plaster began to ripple, to soften, as if it were turning from a solid to a liquid. And a new face began to emerge, a face I knew as well as my own, the face of my dead husband, Michael. It was a perfect, heartbreakingly perfect rendition of him. But his eyes were wrong. They were the same, dark, sad, and intelligent eyes as the face in the bedroom wall. It was him. It was Finch, and he was wearing Michael's face like a mask. "Don't you miss him, Elias?" the wall seemed to whisper. The voice a grotesque and deeply insulting imitation of Michael's own deep and gentle baritone. "It's so lonely here. We could be together, all three of us." The monster was not just trying to steal my face, it was trying to steal my grief. It was using my own most profound and deeply personal pain as a weapon against me. It was the ultimate violation. I screamed, a raw, ragged, and utterly hopeless sound of pure animal rage and despair. I picked up a heavy iron fire poker and I swung it at the wall, at the perfect, beautiful, and monstrous face of my dead husband. The poker hit the wall with a dull, wet, and sickening thud, as if I had struck a side of beef. The plaster did not crack. It bruised. A dark, ugly purplish mark appeared, and the face of Michael contorted, not in pain, but in a slow and deeply, deeply satisfied smile. It was feeding on it. My rage, my despair, my violent and desperate and futile and grief-stricken and love-filled action, they were its food. My emotional energy was the very thing that was allowing it to break through, to become more real, more solid. I dropped the poker, my body going limp with the sudden, horrifying realization I could not fight it. Fighting it only made it stronger. I was in a cage with a monster, and the monster was feeding on my own desperate attempts to escape. I heard the sound of a car on the gravel driveway. Sarah, she was here. I ran to the window. Her small, sensible sedan was parked outside. She was getting out, her face a mask of worried determination. I banged on the window, but the sound was a dull, muted thud. The house was soundproofed from the inside now, too. She couldn't hear me. She went to the front door and knocked. I heard the sound, faint and distant. She tried the knob. It was locked. She called my name. I screamed it back. But my voice was a dead, flat thing in the silent, waiting air of the house. And then I saw it. The plaster on the wall by the front door, the wall right next to where she was standing, began to ripple. A new face was beginning to form. A woman's face. Her face. It was going to take her, too. It was going to surround me with the faces of everyone I had ever loved. A living, breathing, and eternal mausoleum of my own personal history. I was not just going to be its prisoner. I was going to be the curator of my own private hell. In that moment of absolute and final despair, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. I thought of my work, of the faces I drew. I was a man who brought form to the formless, who created order from the chaos of memory. And this house, this entity, was doing the same thing. It was an artist, a monstrous and deeply and profoundly lonely artist, and its medium was me. I could not fight it. I could not run from it. So I had to do the one thing it would not expect. I had to create a piece of art that it could not comprehend. I had to create a new face. I ran back to my studio, the one room in a house that had, so far, remained untouched. I grabbed my sketchbook, my charcoal, my graphite. I sat on the floor, in the center of the living room, my back to the monstrous emerging face of my sister, and I began to draw. I did not draw a face of sadness or of fear or of rage. I did not draw a face from my past. I drew a face from a future that I was now, in this last desperate act, trying to create. I drew a face of pure, unadulterated, and utterly irrational joy. I drew a man laughing, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his mouth open in a wide, beautiful, and unrestrained shout of pure, unbridled happiness. I poured every last remaining ounce of my own depleted life force, of my own desperate hope for a future that was not this, into the drawing. I drew a face that had no place in this house of sorrow. I drew a face that was a lie, a beautiful, powerful, and defiant lie. The whispering in the walls faltered. The rippling of the plaster on the wall behind me slowed and then stopped. The house, the entity, was confused. This was an emotion it did not understand. Joy was a language it did not speak. My grief, my fear, my rage, that was its food, its building material. This was poison. I kept drawing, my hands a frantic, desperate blur. I was not just drawing a picture. I was performing an exorcism. I was fighting a monster not with iron and salt, but with charcoal and hope. The face of Michael on the far wall began to fade, to recede back into the plaster, its perfect, sad features contorting in a look of profound and deep and utter confusion. The house began to groan, a low, structural, and deeply wounded sound. The cold in the air began to recede. I finished the drawing. I held it up. It was the best thing I had ever created. It was a face of pure, impossible, and defiant life. And I taped it to the wall, directly over the spot where the face of my sister had begun to form. "This is my house now," I whispered, my voice a raw and shaky and finally, blessedly, hopeful thing. "And this is the only face you're allowed to have." The house let out a long, shuddering, and deeply mournful sigh, a sound that was not of a monster, but of a lonely and finally defeated thing. And then it was silent. The lock on the front door clicked open. I stumbled to the door and threw it open. Sarah was there, her hand raised to knock again, her face pale with worry. She looked at me, at the wild and ragged and charcoal-smeared and finally, truly and deeply and beautifully alive man that I had become. "Elias," she whispered, "are you okay?" I looked at her, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I smiled. A real smile, a true smile, a smile that was not a memory or a ghost or a lie. It was just a smile. "Yeah," I said, my voice a quiet and steady and finally peaceful thing. "Yeah, I think I am." The first time I noticed the lag, I dismissed it as a trick of the light. My apartment is an old one, a pre-war cavern with floors that sigh and windows that rattle out a mournful, off-key tune when the wind blows in from the river. The mirror in my bathroom is as old as the building itself, a heavy, beveled-edge rectangle with a fine, spidery tracery of desilvering around the edges like a slow, creeping frost. I've always been fond of its imperfections. It gives my reflection a kind of melancholic antique quality, a tintype ghost of my own tired 30-something face. My name is Leo. I'm a professional translator, a man who spends his days in the quiet, meticulous, and sometimes maddeningly precise world of semantics. I work from home, a life of monastic, self-imposed solitude. The mirror is often my only real point of face-to-face contact for days on end. The lag. It was a Tuesday morning. I was brushing my teeth, my movements a familiar, half-conscious ballet of foam and bristles. I moved the brush from the left side of my mouth to the right. And my reflection, it was late. By a fraction of a second, a delay so infinitesimal that if I hadn't been staring directly at it, I would have missed it entirely. My hand was already on the right side of my mouth, but in the mirror it was still on the left. Then, like a lagging video call trying to catch up, the reflection's arm snapped into place, perfectly mimicking my own. I spat into the sink, my heart giving a sudden, curious thump. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogging a small oval patch. I raised my right hand. The reflection raised its right hand. I wiggled my fingers. It wiggled its fingers. It was perfect, a perfect, synchronous, and utterly reliable law of physics. I shook my head, a small self-deprecating laugh escaping my lips. I was tired. My eyes were playing tricks on me. I had been translating a particularly dense and deeply tedious German philosophical text for 12 hours straight. My brain was clearly misfiring. But the next morning, it happened again. This time, I was combing my hair. I lifted the comb to my head, and the reflection was a beat behind. A tiny, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present delay. It was like watching a movie where the sound was a few frames out of sync with the picture. The dissonance was subtle, but deeply, profoundly unnerving. My rational mind, the part of me that translates legal documents and abhors ambiguity, immediately began to construct a list of logical explanations. It was a neurological issue, a mild, undiagnosed form of visual processing disorder, a side effect of my chronic low-level caffeine addiction. I made an appointment with an optometrist. I cut back on coffee, but the lag continued, and it began to get worse. The fraction of a second became a full second, then two. I would turn my head, and my reflection would hold its position for a long, pregnant, and deeply unsettling moment before it, too, would turn, its movement a little too smooth, a little too fluid, as if to make up for its tardiness. My morning routine became a ritual of slow-motion, paranoid dread. I would stand before the mirror, my heart pounding, performing a series of simple, deliberate movements, a terrified conductor trying to lead an orchestra that was perpetually and deliberately out of time. I began to notice other changes. The reflection was no longer just late. It was different. The dark, tired circles under my eyes, a permanent fixture of my own face, were fainter on the reflection. The small, worried frown line between my eyebrows was absent. The reflection looked better, more rested, more confident. It was me, but it was a version of me that had been getting a full, uninterrupted 8 hours of sleep. I stopped using the bathroom mirror. I started shaving in the kitchen sink, using a small, cheap plastic travel mirror that I propped up on the counter, but I couldn't avoid all reflective surfaces. The darkened screen of my computer monitor, the window of a passing bus, the polished chrome of the elevator doors in my building, in every surface, in every fleeting, distorted glimpse of myself, I could see it. The lag, the subtle and growing dissonance between my own real-time movements and the delayed and slightly improved version of me that was looking back. I had to understand. I was a man who believed in research, in evidence. I set up a camera. I mounted my high-speed digital camera on a tripod in the bathroom, aimed directly at the mirror. I stood before it, and I performed my strange, new, and terrifying daily ballet. I raised my arms. I turned my head. I smiled, a pained, forced, and deeply unnatural grimace. I loaded the footage onto my computer and slowed it down, frame by agonizing frame. The evidence was undeniable. It was not a trick of my own fallible and increasingly terrified perception. It was real. Frame 1. My arm begins to rise. The reflection remains still. Frame 2. My arm is halfway up. The reflection's arm begins its ascent. The lag was consistently and quantifiably 24 frames, a single, solid, and scientifically proven second of impossible, reality-bending delay. And then I saw something else, something that made the blood in my veins turn to a slush of pure icy terror. As I was lowering my arm for a single, solitary frame, just before the reflection began its own delayed descent, it smiled. My own face in the foreground of the shot was a mask of tense, worried concentration. But the face in the mirror, for 1/24th of a second, was wearing a slow, easy, and deeply, deeply malevolent grin. My apartment, my quiet, solitary, and safe little world, was no longer my own. It was a shared space. I was living with a roommate who lived on the other side of the glass, a roommate who was becoming more and more confident, more and more independent with every passing day. my research became an obsession. I dove into the dark, strange, and esoteric corners of physics and philosophy. I read about quantum entanglement, about parallel universes, about the holographic principle. I was a man drowning in a sea of theories, looking for a single, solid piece of driftwood to cling to. I found a strange and deeply unsettling paper by an obscure and largely discredited physicist from the 1970s named Dr. Eris Thorne. He had postulated a theory he called psychic inertia. He believed that a strong, focused consciousness could, over time, leave a kind of energetic residue on its immediate and most frequently observed environment. He believed that mirrors, especially old mercury-backed ones, were particularly susceptible to this phenomenon. He theorized that a mirror in a person's home over the course of decades did not just reflect a person's image, it absorbed a faint, echoic, and cumulative impression of their identity. He believed that, under certain rare and deeply traumatic circumstances, this stored psychic energy could cohere. It could gain a kind of momentum, a kind of life of its own. The reflection is not a ghost, he wrote. It is a habit. It is the accumulated and deeply ingrained memory of the person it has been reflecting for a lifetime. And if the original should undergo a sudden and profound psychological or emotional shift, a deep grief, a debilitating depression, the reflection, the habit, may be stronger than the original. It may, in a very real sense, refuse to change. It may choose to continue being the person it has always been, the person it remembers rather than the broken, altered version of the person it is now seeing. The words on the page were a cold, hard, and perfectly fitting key to the lock of my own private madness. My life had been one of deep and profound and deeply ingrained routine. And then 6 months ago, my mother had died. It had not been a sudden, tragic death, but a slow, cruel, and deeply undignified wasting away from a cancer that had consumed her, and in the process had consumed my own quiet and carefully ordered life. I had been her primary caregiver for the last terrible year, and her death had not been a release. It had been an amputation. The grief had hollowed me out, had replaced the quiet, thoughtful, and sometimes even happy man I had once been with this new, gray, and perpetually tired ghost. My reflection had not changed with me. It was still him, the old Leo, the better Leo, and it was, it seemed, fighting to reassert itself. The lag was no longer just a delay. It was a period of silent and deeply unsettling rebellion. I would walk away from the mirror, and my reflection would stay for a full 10 seconds, its head tilted, its expression a mixture of pity and contempt, before it would turn and walk, not out of frame, but deeper into the strange, silvered and two-dimensional world of its own. The physical phenomena began. The temperature in the bathroom dropped. A cold, palpable, and deeply unnatural chill seemed to emanate from the glass itself. I would hear a soft, whispering sound at night, a sound that was not quite my own voice, but a clearer, more confident, and more articulate version of it. It would be speaking in French or in German, the languages I translated, but it would be speaking them with a fluency, a poetry, that I, in my own waking and deeply insecure life, had never been able to achieve. He was not just a reflection anymore. He was a presence, and he was growing stronger, more defined, while I, in the real world, felt like I was fading, becoming more and more like a faint and poorly rendered copy of him. I knew I had to get rid of it. The mirror. I had to smash it. I had to break the connection. But I was afraid. My own superstitious and deeply irrational mind was filled with the old childish fears. 7 years of bad luck. But it was more than that. I was afraid that if I broke the mirror, I would not be destroying him, but releasing him, or that I would be destroying the last, remaining, and better part of myself. The night he finally spoke to me, the voice was not in the room. It was in my head, a clear, calm, and deeply rational thought that was not my own. I was standing before the mirror, the nightly morbid ritual now an ingrained and deeply masochistic habit. He was there, his image clear and steady, the lag now a full and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and terrifyingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and, I'm sorry, the words, they are difficult. He was there. The lag was a full 30 seconds, a half a minute of my own personal and deeply real time that he now possessed. He was looking at me, his expression calm and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and, "It doesn't have to be this way, Leo," the thought whispered in the quiet, empty, and suddenly crowded space of my own mind. "You are so tired. You are so sad. Let me help you." "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice a dry, rattling, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and, "I am you," the thought replied. "The you that you were meant to be. The you that existed before the world broke you. I am the blueprint. You are the flawed and fading copy. But we can be whole again. We can merge. I can fix you." He raised his hand and pressed it to the surface of the glass, and I felt a cold, tingling sensation on my own chest, as if his fingers were reaching through the glass, through the air, and into my very soul. I stumbled back, a raw, ragged, and deeply, and profoundly, and unsettlingly, and strangely, and beautifully, and tragically, and comically, and I stumbled back. The connection broke. The feeling was gone. He was not trying to help me. He was trying to replace me. He was a psychic vampire, a ghost of my own, former self, and he was trying to reclaim his old life, his old body. I knew then that I had to fight. I had to do what I should have done weeks ago. I went to the garage. I found a hammer, a heavy steel, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a hammer. I walked back to the bathroom. He was there in the mirror waiting for me, and he was smiling. He knew what I was about to do, and he was not afraid. "You can't destroy me without destroying yourself," he thought, his voice a calm and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a confident voice. "I am your past. I am your strength. I am all the good and strong and unbroken parts of you. You are nothing without me." I looked at him, at the better me, the me who had not spent a year watching his mother die, the me who had not inherited her deep and profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and her sadness. And I understood. He was right. He was all the parts of me that had not been touched by the grief, by the pain, by the messy and beautiful and heartbreaking and real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and the real parts of life. He was not the better me. He was the lesser me. He was the me that had never truly lived. "You are not my strength," I said, my own voice, for the first time in a year, clear and steady and strong. "You are my anchor. You are the ghost of a man I am no longer, and I am letting you go." I raised the hammer. He did not flinch. He just smiled, sad and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a pitying smile. And I did not bring the hammer down on the mirror. I turned, and I brought the hammer down with all the strength and all the grief and all the pain and all the rage and all the love I possessed on my own, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and I smashed the sink. The porcelain exploded in a shower of white, sharp, and beautifully and wonderfully and finally, blessedly real fragments. The reflection watched, his smile faltering, a flicker of confusion in his perfect, rested, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and his eyes. I was not playing his game. I was not trying to destroy him. I was destroying his world, the perfect, pristine, and untouched bathroom he inhabited. I brought the hammer down on the tiled floor, the tiles cracking and splintering. I smashed the light fixture. I shattered the medicine cabinet. I was a whirlwind of creative and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a destructive force. I was a man not just accepting his own broken and messy reality, but embracing it. I was making my world as broken and as real and as beautifully and wonderfully and finally, blessedly, imperfect as I was. He screamed, silent and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a psychic scream of pure, unadulterated and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and rage, his world, his perfect and pristine and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and his world was now a reflection of my own, chaotic and beautiful and wonderful and finally, blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a mess. The lag began to disappear. The dissonance was gone. Our worlds were once again in sync, a perfect and shattered and beautifully and wonderfully and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and they were the same. He was no longer stronger. We were equals, two broken men in two broken rooms. And then I did the final and most difficult thing. I looked at him, at my own, sad and tired and broken and beautiful and wonderful, and finally blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and I looked at myself, and I forgave him. I forgave myself. I forgave myself for the grief. I forgave myself for the sadness. I forgave myself for not being the perfect and strong and unbroken man that he was. And in that act of forgiveness, he faded. He was not destroyed. He was reabsorbed. The echo was reconciled with the source. The habit was broken. The two separate and warring parts of me were once again whole. The mirror was just a mirror again. My reflection was just my reflection. The lag was gone. I live in a broken bathroom now. I have not fixed it. It is a monument, not to my grief, but to my victory. It is a reminder that the most beautiful things in the world are not the perfect and pristine and untouched ones. They are the ones that have been broken and have been put back together. They are the ones that have the scars to prove that they have survived. They are the ones that are finally and blessedly real. The mirror was the first thing I unpacked. It was a ridiculous, impractical object, a relic from a life of quiet, scholarly eccentricity that was not my own. It had belonged to my great-uncle, a man I'd met only a handful of times, a reclusive historian who had lived and died in a house that smelled of decaying books and pipe tobacco. When his estate was being divided, none of the sensible relatives wanted the mirror. It was too big, too ornate. A monstrous 6-foot-tall slab of mercury glass set in a frame of ebonized wood that was carved with an unsettling menagerie of sleeping cherubs and coiling serpentine vines. They called it gaudy. I called it beautiful. I was an art restorer, a man who made his living peeling back the grime of centuries to find the truth of an artist's original vision. I appreciated things with a complicated and preferably dark history, so I took it. My name is Thomas, and my greatest flaw has always been an attraction to the beautiful, broken things of the world. I had just moved into a new apartment, a cavernous, empty loft in a converted warehouse district. The move was a desperate attempt to paint over the canvas of a life that had recently been scraped bare. My long-term relationship had ended, my freelance work had dried up, and the city I had once loved now felt like a gallery of ghosts, every street corner holding a memory I couldn't bear to look at. This new space, with its high ceilings, its vast, empty walls, and its profound industrial silence, was meant to be a blank slate. I hung the mirror on the long brick wall that dominated the main living space. It was a two-man job, but I did it alone, my muscles straining, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Once it was up, it transformed the room. It didn't just reflect the space, it seemed to consume it. Its dark, slightly distorted glass creating a deeper, colder, more melancholic version of my empty loft. It was a perfect reflection of my own internal landscape. For the first few weeks, the mirror was just a part of the furniture. I'd catch my reflection in it as I paced the floors, a pale, tired-looking man with hollows under his eyes, a ghost haunting his own half-furnished life. The reflection was always slightly off, a quirk of the old hand-poured glass. It made me look thinner, my movements slightly delayed, as if the light had to struggle to escape the silver depths. The first time I saw him, it was a flicker, so brief and so subtle that I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a symptom of sleep deprivation, and a diet that consisted primarily of coffee and regret. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, which was off the main living area. I glanced out into the loft, and in the mirror, for a fraction of a second, my reflection wasn't alone. Another figure, a shadow, stood behind it. I spun around, my heart giving a sudden hard lurch. The loft was empty. I looked back at the mirror. My own solitary, haggard reflection stared back. A migraine aura, I told myself, a retinal floater. The rational mind is a masterful storyteller, and it will weave the most elaborate fictions to avoid a single terrifying truth. The next night, it happened again. I was standing in front of the mirror, my tie half done, preparing for a gallery opening I had no desire to attend. I was practicing my everything is fine smile, a pained, unnatural grimace. And then my reflection smile became real. It was a slow, easy, confident grin, the kind of smile I hadn't been able to produce in years. As I watched, frozen, my own face a mask of slack-jawed shock, my reflection raised its right hand and adjusted its own perfectly knotted tie. My own hand was still frozen at my sides. The moment lasted for a single heart-stopping second, and then the reflection was mine again, a perfect, synchronous mimic of my own horrified expression. I didn't go to the gallery. I spent the night on my sofa, the lights on, staring at the mirror, which hung on the far wall like a dark, dormant portal. The sleepwalker's logic of the first night, the tricks of the light, the tired mind, was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp, and deeply unsettling certainty. There was someone else in the mirror, and he looked exactly like me. I am an only child. I have never had a brother, let alone a twin. The scientific, rational part of my brain, the part that understood the precise chemical composition of 17th century oil paints, scrambled for an explanation. It was a complex optical illusion, a flaw in the mercury backen, creating a kind of persistent secondary reflection. It was a bizarre, specific form of neurological disorder, a Capgras delusion for my own reflection. I clung to these theories, these little islands of sanity in a rising sea of the impossible, but I couldn't ignore the evidence, and so I began to study it. I became a scientist, and my own reflection was the subject of my terrifying nightly experiment. I set up a camera on a tripod, aimed at the mirror. I started a journal, a logbook of the impossible. Night 3, appearance at 10:17 p.m., duration, approximately 3 seconds. The secondary reflection, I'm calling him Tom for the sake of clarity, materialized while I was turning away from the mirror. In the recording, my body turns, but the reflection of Tom remains facing forward for a full 3 seconds before it vanishes. It did not move, it just watched. Night 4, appearance at 11:02 p.m., duration 5 seconds. I was standing perfectly still, staring into the mirror. Tom appeared. He was a perfect mimic for the first 2 seconds, and then he blinked. I had consciously kept my own eyes from blinking. He blinked twice, a slow, deliberate gesture. The recording is clear. It is not my imagination. Night 5, appearance at 9:45 p.m., duration 8 seconds. This was the most significant event yet. Tom's appearance is becoming clearer, more solid. Tonight, I noticed a difference in our faces. The dark circles under my eyes were absent from his. The small, worried crease between my eyebrows was gone. He looked rested, healthier. He looked like me from before everything. The pattern was undeniable. Every night, his appearance lasted a few seconds longer. The progression was slow, methodical, as deliberate and certain as the turning of the earth. He was not a random glitch. He was a presence, a consciousness, and he was growing stronger, solidifying his existence in the silvered world behind the glass. My loft, my blank slate, became my prison. I was too terrified to leave for long periods of time, but I was also too terrified to be there. I became a creature of the daylight, doing my work, my errands, in a frantic, sunlit haze. But as dusk began to fall, a deep, primal dread would settle in my bones. I would find myself drawn to the mirror, a moth to a flame that I knew was going to incinerate my sanity. The nightly appearances became the one fixed point in my disintegrating life. I had to understand the mirror. It was the source. I went back to the lawyer who had handled my great-uncle's estate and asked for his personal effects. I was given a single, dusty cardboard box of journals and letters. I spent the next week of my life hunched over my kitchen table, a modern-day Jonathan Harker, sifting through the brittle, yellowed pages of my great-uncle Henry's life. The faint, sweet smell of his pipe tobacco, a ghostly, constant companion. Henry, it turned out, had not been a simple historian. He had been a collector of the esoteric, a quiet, scholarly member of a society that studied what he called sympathetic objects, items that, through their history or their very composition, had become attuned to something beyond the physical world. The journals were filled with his research on haunted artifacts, on psychometry, on the resonant properties of objects, and then I found the entries on the mirror. He had purchased it in 1973 from a small back-alley antique shop in Prague. He called it the Viridian Mirror, after the name of its creator, a 19th-century artisan and occultist named Alaric Viridian. Viridian, according to my uncle's meticulous research, had been a follower of a fringe, mystical philosophy that believed reality was not a single linear path, but an infinite branching tree of possibilities. He believed that every choice we made, every path not taken, created a faint, echoic shadow reality, and he believed he could build a gateway to those shadows. Viridian's theory was not of ghosts, my uncle wrote, his script a neat, precise academic hand. It was of echoes. He did not believe the mirror held the spirits of the dead. He believed it was a resonant chamber, tuned to the frequency of potential. The glass, he claimed, was not silvered with mercury, but with the unique, unstable silver amalgam mixed with the ground, powdered dust of meteorites, iron from stars that had traveled through an infinity of other skies. He believed this stellar iron acted as an antenna for the echoes of what he called our umbra selves, our shadow selves, the versions of us that exist in the adjacent, unrealized realities created by our life's choices. I felt a wave of cold intellectual terror. This wasn't a haunting. It was a problem of quantum physics. The man in the mirror was not a ghost. He was the me who had taken a different path. The me who had not met Sarah. The me who had not chosen a life that would eventually lead to this specific, lonely, grief-stricken loft. He was the me who had, apparently, made all the right choices. The journal entries grew more personal, more disturbed. "The phenomenon is consistent," Henry wrote. "I have observed him for a week now. The echo, my echo, appears for a few seconds longer each night. He seems unaware of me, a perfect but slightly healthier reflection. I must conclude that the mirror is not just a window. The act of observation, of focusing one's own consciousness upon the echo, seems to be feeding it, solidifying it, drawing it closer to the surface of the glass." I dropped the journal, my hand shaking. I had been feeding him. My obsessive, terrified attention was the very thing that was giving him strength. The final entry on the mirror was a single, cryptic, and utterly terrifying sentence written in a shaky, hurried hand, very different from my uncle's usual calm script. "He is no longer me. The echo is becoming its own man. I must stop watching. I pray it is not too late." After that, there was no more mention of the mirror. The last few years of my uncle's journals were filled with a desperate new obsession, the study of migratory birds. It was the frantic, all-consuming hobby of a man who was trying, with every fiber of his being, to look at anything other than his own reflection. My nightly experiments took on a new, desperate urgency. The echo, my shadow self, Tom, was no longer just a passive reflection. He was becoming an individual. He had stopped mimicking my movements entirely. Now he would just stand there in his version of my loft and watch me. His world was a perfect but subtly different reflection of my own. The abstract painting on his wall was hung a few inches to the left. The stack of books on his coffee table was neater. His world was more ordered, more perfect. And then he began to interact. It started with a smile. I would be staring at him, my face a mask of sleepless, paranoid dread, and he would smile. A slow, pitying, almost condescending smile. Then he began to mouth words at me. At first, they were too fast, too indistinct, but I had the camera. I could slow the footage down. I could read the silent movements of his lips. The first word I was able to decipher was my own name, Thomas. The second was a question. Why are you so sad? I was having a one-sided silent conversation with a version of myself who lived in a parallel universe inside my antique, haunted mirror. The sheer clinical insanity of the situation was so overwhelming that I almost laughed. The physical phenomena began a week later. A cold spot developed in the loft, a permanent pocket of frigid air in a 5-foot radius around the mirror. The lights would flicker whenever I got too close to it. And the sound, a faint, high-pitched, almost subliminal ringing, like the sound of a tuning fork, would emanate from a glass at night. The barrier was weakening. Tom was becoming more tangible. The reflection was no longer just a flat, two-dimensional image. It had depth. I could see the dust motes floating in the air of his version of the loft. I could see the subtle, realistic play of light and shadow on his face. And he was growing bolder. One night, he walked right up to the surface of the mirror, his reflection becoming life-sized, as if he were standing just on the other side of a pane of glass. He raised his hand and pressed his palm flat against the surface. I flinched back, my heart seizing. His hand was a perfect mirror image of my own, and on his face was an expression I had never seen on my own reflection. An expression of profound, hungry, and terrible longing. He was not just a curious echo anymore. He wanted something. I knew what I had to do. I had to get rid of the mirror. I had to smash it, to burn it, to do what my great-uncle had clearly been too afraid to do. But I hesitated. It was a beautiful object, a historical artifact, and a darker, more honest part of me was afraid of what would happen if I tried. What if breaking the mirror didn't destroy him but released him? My hesitation was my undoing. The night he finally spoke, the sound was not a voice but a thought implanted directly into my mind. I was lying on my sofa, feigning sleep, watching him on the live feed from the camera on my laptop. He was standing at the glass again, his eyes fixed on my sleeping form on the sofa in the reflection. "It's so cold here, Thomas," the thought whispered in the quiet, empty space of my own skull. "My world is fading. It's just an echo. It has no substance, no warmth. You have so much you don't even appreciate." I sat bolt upright, my own silent scream echoing in my mind. He could project his thoughts. The bridge between our worlds was no longer just visual, it was telepathic. I don't want to hurt you, thought continued, a wave of calming, seductive reassurance. I want to help you. You are so broken, so sad. I am not. I can fix this life. I can be the better version of you. We can merge. We can be whole again. I scrambled off the sofa and backed away, my hands raised as if to ward off a physical blow. No, I whispered, the sound of dry, rattling thing in my own throat. It doesn't have to be a fight, he projected, and this time his thought was tinged with a cold, sharp edge of impatience. But I am getting stronger, and this world is so much brighter, so much more real. A body can only have one soul, Thomas, and yours is so very tired. I was losing. He was a parasite, and my reality was the host. He was stronger, healthier, more confident. He was the idealized potential version of me, and he was coming to claim the original. I had to fight back. But how do you fight your own better self? How do you fight a reflection? My great-uncle's last sane journal entries held the key. He had written about resonance, about the observer effect. My focused, fearful attention was feeding the echo. So I had to do the opposite. I had to sever the connection. I had to create a dissonance so profound that the echo could no longer find its sympathetic frequency. My plan was desperate and probably insane. I couldn't destroy the mirror, but I could destroy the reflection. I had to become someone he could no longer recognize, someone he could no longer mimic. I had to shatter the very image of myself. I started with my appearance. I took a pair of scissors and hacked at my own hair, leaving it a ragged, uneven mess. I took a razor and shaved my head completely, leaving a pale, vulnerable, and utterly unfamiliar stranger staring back at me from the bathroom mirror. I let my beard grow, a wild, unkempt thing. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating properly. I let the haggard, haunted look in my eyes deepen. I was becoming a monster to fight a monster. And it was working. The appearances of Tom became agitated. He would stand there in his perfect, well-lit world, his own hair still perfectly coiffed, and he would stare at the broken, ragged thing I was becoming with an expression of confusion and disgust. The reflection was no longer perfect. The dissonance was growing, but it wasn't enough. He was still there, his presence a constant, silent judgment. I had to go deeper. I had to change not just my appearance, but my reality. My loft, the silent, minimalist space that he had so perfectly mirrored, had to become a place he could not recognize. I began to fill it with chaos. I painted a massive, chaotic, abstract mural on the long brick wall, a riot of angry clashing colors. I brought in mismatched junk shop furniture, creating a cluttered, illogical landscape. I filled the silence with noise, playing loud, dissonant, experimental music at all hours. My sanctuary became a madhouse. My blank slate became a canvas of pure, chaotic energy. Tom's world in the mirror did not change. It remained the clean, minimalist, perfect version of my old loft. And now, when I looked in the mirror, the contrast was absolute. I was a ragged, wild-eyed creature standing in a room that looked like a paint factory had exploded, staring at a calm, well-dressed man in a serene, orderly space. We were no longer echoes. We were opposites. The telepathic whispers grew frantic, angry. What are you doing? You are destroying it. You are destroying us. There is no us, I said, my voice a raw, defiant croak, speaking to the mirror for the first time. There is only me, and this is my life. This is my mess. The final confrontation came on the 37th night since his first appearance. His time in the mirror had grown to nearly 5 minutes, a long, silent, nightly staring contest. But he was weaker now. His image would flicker, his form would waver, like a television signal struggling to hold on. The dissonance was working. My reality was becoming too chaotic, too noisy for his perfect silent echo to find a purchase. I knew I had to deliver the final blow. I had to do the one thing that was the antithesis of his perfect, ordered, successful existence. I had to embrace my own most profound failure. I went to the box of things Sarah had left behind. In the bottom was a small velvet box. I opened it. Inside was the engagement ring I had bought for her, a simple, beautiful, and now heartbreakingly painful object. I had never been able to bring myself to sell it. It was the ultimate symbol of the future I had planned, the life I had lost. It was the cornerstone of my grief. I walked to the mirror. Tom was there, his form flickering wildly. He saw the box in my hand, and his face contorted in a silent, telepathic scream of rage and despair. This was a part of my history, a pain, a failure, that he had no access to. His world was a world where I had never met her, where I had never experienced this specific, defining heartbreak. No, he screamed in my mind, that is not part of the equation. That is a flaw, an imperfection. That's all life is, I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. A collection of beautiful, tragic, unforgivable imperfections. I looked at my own ravaged reflection in the mirror, at the bald, bearded, wild-eyed stranger I had become, and I looked at him, the perfect, handsome, successful man I might have been, and for the first time I felt not fear, but a profound, overwhelming pity for him. He was trapped in a world without scars, a world without history, a world without love or loss. He was not the better version of me. He was the lesser one. He was just a ghost of a possibility. I took the ring from its box. You are just an echo, I said, and I am turning off the sound. And with a final defiant scream of rage and grief and liberation, I drew back my arm and threw the ring as hard as I could at the center of a mirror. The impact was not the sharp, clean sound of breaking glass. It was a deep, resonant, bell-like bong, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. A spiderweb of black, lightning-like cracks erupted from the point of impact, spreading across the surface of the glass. The image of Tom, of his perfect, silent world, shattered into 1,000 distorting fragments. He gave one final silent scream, his face a mosaic of agony and disbelief, and then he was gone. The mirror was dark. The cold spot in the room vanished. The high-pitched ringing in my ears faded into a profound, peaceful silence. It was over. I stood there for a long time, my own fractured, broken reflection staring back at me from the shattered glass. I had won. I had fought my own perfect self, and I had won, not by being stronger, but by being more broken. The next day, I took the mirror down. I wrapped it in blankets, a shroud for a dead god, and I carried it to the deepest, most forgotten part of the warehouse basement and left it there, facing the wall. I did not destroy it. It was a part of my history now, a part of my story. I live in the chaos now. My loft is still a mess of clashing colors and mismatched furniture. My hair is starting to grow back in uneven, patchy tufts. I am still a work in progress, a restoration project. I have other mirrors in my apartment now, small, simple, modern ones, and when I look into them, I just see me, a tired, scarred, and beautifully, wonderfully imperfect man, there are no echoes, there are no ghosts. There is just the single, flawed, and finally, blessedly singular reality of my own life. And I have learned that it is more than enough. I bought a used camera. The last picture was of me sleeping. The scent of a pawn shop is a unique perfume, a layered olfactory history of desperation, forgotten hobbies, and the faint, metallic tang of regret. It's a smell I've always found strangely comforting. I'm a photographer, but not the kind who chases the crisp, sterile perfection of digital. I'm a creature of the darkroom, a lover of film grain, light leaks, and the tangible magic of a silver gelatin print coming to life in a tray of chemicals. I hunt for relics, for cameras with stories baked into their brass and leather. My name is Jacob, and I believe that old lenses see the world differently, that they hold the ghosts of every image they've ever captured. I never imagined how literally true that could be. The shop was a dusty, cluttered cave on a forgotten side street, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't specifically looking for the faded peeling sign that read, "Second Chances." I was killing time, waiting for inspiration to strike, a common affliction since my ex-girlfriend Chloe had moved out 6 months prior, taking the vibrant color palette of our shared life with her and leaving me in a world of muted grays. It was in the back, under a table piled high with defunct VCRs and sad-looking porcelain dolls, that I saw it. It was a Lichtner A7, a beautiful, brutish piece of German engineering from the 1960s. It was a rangefinder, heavy and solid, its black enamel worn to a soft patina on the corners, its lens a single, unblinking cyclops eye. It felt less like a machine and more like a dense, mechanical heart in my hands. The shopkeeper, a man whose face seemed to be made of intersecting wrinkles, gave me a rheumy-eyed look. "That one? Been here for ages," he rasped. "Found it in an estate lot. As is, of course." "Does the shutter work?" I asked, my thumb finding the familiar, satisfying resistance of the film advance lever. He shrugged, a gesture that moved his entire upper body. "Probably. Thing's built like a Panzer tank. $10. It was the kind of deal that makes your heart beat a little faster." I paid the man, feeling a thrill of discovery, a brief, bright spark in the monochrome landscape of my recent life. I took it home to my apartment, a third-floor walk-up with creaky floors and a view of a brick wall, the kind of place that's perfect for brooding artists and other assorted cliches. The real surprise came when I opened the back. There was a roll of film still inside. This was the holy grail for a junk shop connoisseur like me. A found history, a tiny orphan time capsule. The film was an old, off-brand black and white. The counter stopped at 24 exposures. I felt a giddy sense of voyeuristic anticipation. Who was the previous owner? What moments had they deemed worthy of capture? My bathroom doubles as my dark room. I sealed the door with a towel, the familiar, comforting darkness enveloping me. The smell of fixer and stop bath was my incense. I went through the ritual, my hands moving with practiced confidence in the dim, ruby glow of the safe light. I unspooled the film, clipped it, and submerged it in the developer. I watched the clock, gently agitating the tank, my mind racing with possibilities. An hour later, the negatives were hanging to dry, a glistening celluloid ribbon of someone else's life. I held them up to the light, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and a strange, almost reverent respect. The first 23 pictures were unremarkable. They were the anonymous, slightly melancholic photos of a life lived, a blurry shot of a child on a swing, a close-up of a cat's face, a rain-slicked street at night, the streetlights blooming like soft, ethereal flowers, several overexposed photos of what looked like the interior of an old, cluttered house. They were competent, but lonely. The compositions were slightly off, the subjects always distant. They felt like the work of a ghost, someone observing the world without ever truly participating in it. Then I looked at the last frame, number 24. My breath hitched in my chest. A cold, sharp icicle of dread seemed to pierce my sternum and travel down my spine. I took the negative strip and put it in the enlarger, needing to see it in stark, undeniable black and white. I focused the image, my hand suddenly clumsy and slick with a sweat I hadn't noticed. The image bloomed into life on the photographic paper in the developing tray, a ghost emerging from the chemical ether. It was a picture of me, sleeping, in my bed, in my apartment. The angle was from the foot of the bed, looking towards the headboard. I was on my side, my face half buried in the pillow. The details were so horrifically, intimately correct that my mind buckled under the weight of them. The specific, rumpled way my comforter was bunched up. The book on my nightstand, a collection of poetry Chloe had left behind, its cover clearly legible. The glass of water beside it, even the shadow cast on the wall by my bedside lamp, was perfect, a familiar nightly silhouette. My first thought was that it was a prank, an incredibly elaborate, cruel prank. My mind immediately went to Chloe, but this wasn't her style. She was practical, grounded. She wouldn't know the first thing about developing film, let alone staging something so violating, and we hadn't spoken in months. My other friends, none of them had a key. My second thought was more technical, a double exposure, a bizarre 1-in-a-million fluke where my face had been superimposed over an image of an empty bed. I was a photographer. I knew the science. I could debunk this. I grabbed my loupe and examined the negative again, my heart thumping a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. The grain was consistent. The light source was singular. The shadows were perfect. It was a single, unmodified, horrifyingly real photograph. My apartment, which had always felt like a sanctuary, a shell I could retreat into, suddenly felt violated, porous. The air itself felt thick with a hostile presence. I walked into my bedroom and stood at the foot of the bed, my eyes darting around the room. The perspective matched perfectly. The photographer had been standing right here, in my room, while I slept. Who had owned this camera, and how, in the name of all that was sane and logical, had they taken a picture of me before I had even bought it? The film had been in the camera when I found it. The thought was a paradox, a Mobius strip of impossibility that my rational mind couldn't navigate. That night, sleep was a foreign country I couldn't find a visa for. I sat on my sofa, the lights on, the Lichner A7 on the coffee table in front of me. It wasn't just a camera anymore. It was a witness, an accomplice. It seemed to watch me with its single glass eye, its black body absorbing the light, giving nothing back. I felt a primal, superstitious urge to smash it, to shatter its lens and exorcise whatever malevolent history it held. But I was also a photographer. It was a beautiful object, and a deeper, more frightening part of me needed to understand. I wedged a chair under the doorknob, a flimsy, pathetic defense against an intruder who had seemingly already bypassed all logic and security. Every creak of the old building, every siren in the distant city was the sound of them coming back. I must have eventually drifted off because I woke up with a jolt, my neck stiff. The gray, unforgiving light of dawn filtering through the blinds. The first thing I did was check the chair. It was still there. I was alone. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave with the night. It clung to me like a damp shroud. At my job, a soulless but necessary gig retouching real estate photos, I couldn't focus. I kept seeing movement in the corners of my screen. I'd glance over my shoulder in the office, convinced someone was standing behind me. I spent my lunch break in a frantic, paranoid online search. I typed in Lixner A7 and strange photos. I waded through forums of camera collectors, their posts filled with arcane discussions of shutter speeds and lens coatings. And then I found it. A single cryptic post on an obscure German photography forum dated from 10 years ago. The post was titled Schattenkamera? Shadow Camera? The user, who went by the name Collector88, wrote about a legend associated with a small specific batch of Lichtner A7s produced in the winter of 1963. The legend claimed the lenses were made with a new type of quartz-infused glass mined from a strange, geologically unique site in the Black Forest. The cameras, the legend went, didn't just capture light. They captured something else, an echo, a premonition. The post called them Seelenfängers, soul catchers. It mentioned the original designer, a man named Klaus Richter, who had become a recluse and died in a mental asylum, obsessed with the idea that his cameras were showing him pictures of things that hadn't happened yet. The post ended with a chilling single line. There are stories of owners disappearing, leaving behind only the camera and a final, undeveloped roll of film. I felt a wave of nausea. This was insane. Urban legends, internet ghost stories. But the story had the chilling ring of a truth I didn't want to acknowledge. That night, my paranoia graduated to active measures. I bought a new, heavy-duty deadbolt for my door. I installed a cheap, motion-activated webcam on my bookshelf, aimed at my bed. I was turning my home into a fortress, but I felt more vulnerable than ever. I took the Lixner and locked it in a metal footlocker in my closet, as if I could contain its curse through simple physical confinement. For a week, there was nothing. The webcam recorded nothing but 8 hours of me sleeping fitfully. The feeling of being watched began to recede, replaced by the weary, self-mocking thought that I had let a strange coincidence drive me to the brink of a nervous breakdown. I almost convinced myself it was all in my head. Then I came home from work to find the footlocker in my closet open. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice water. The lock was not broken. It was unlocked. I knew with an absolute gut-wrenching certainty that I had locked it, and inside, sitting innocently on a pile of old sweaters, was the Lixner. I backed out of the closet, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Someone had been here, again. But the new deadbolt on my front door was still locked from the inside. The windows were all latched. There was no way in. My eyes fell on the webcam. I scrambled to my laptop, my hand shaking so badly I could barely type my password. I opened the security footage from the day. I fast-forwarded through the long, empty hours of my vacant apartment. Nothing. No movement, no intruders. The footlocker remained closed and locked. I replayed it, watching the timestamp in the corner. Then I saw it. At exactly 3:33 p.m., the video feed flickered. For a single frame, the screen went to black static. When the image returned, a millisecond later, the footlocker was open. It hadn't been opened. It had just become open, as if reality itself had been briefly edited. A single, crucial frame of the film of my life snipped out, leaving a seamless, impossible jump cut. With a sense of dread so profound it felt like I was moving underwater, I picked up the camera. The film counter, which had been at 0, now read 1. A new picture had been taken. I didn't want to see it. Every cell in my body screamed at me to take the camera and throw it into the deepest part of the river. But I had to know. I was a prisoner to this thing, and the only way out was to understand the nature of my cell. Back in the dark room, the ruby light felt less like a comfort and more like the glow of a hellish fire. My hands trembled as I developed the single frame. The image that emerged was worse than the first. It was a picture of me in the shower. The photo was taken through the frosted glass of the shower door, my form a blurry, vulnerable silhouette. But the detail was still cruelly precise. The specific brand of shampoo on the shelf. The small, crescent-shaped scar on my left shoulder. The angle was from inside the small, windowless bathroom. It was a picture of a private, unguarded moment taken by an invisible, impossible voyeur. The camera was no longer just showing me the past. It was actively documenting my present. It was with me, always. The next few weeks were a descent into a private waking nightmare. The pictures kept appearing, one every few days. A single frame would be exposed on whatever roll of film I had in the camera. I tried leaving it empty, but a new, unexposed negative would simply materialize inside it. A picture of me at my desk at work, taken from over my shoulder. A picture of me buying groceries, taken from the other end of the aisle. A picture of me on the phone with my mother, my face etched with a fake, cheerful smile as I lied and told her everything was fine. Each one was a new violation, a new piece of evidence that my life was no longer my own. The photographer was a ghost, a demon, a glitch in the matrix. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was intimately, malevolently connected to the listener. I tried to get rid of it. I drove 40 miles out of the city and threw it into a landfill. I came home, exhausted and relieved, to find it sitting on my pillow. I smashed it with a hammer, the lens shattering, the body dented and broken. The next morning, it was on my kitchen table, fully repaired without a single scratch. It was a part of my life now, a tumorous, malignant growth that I could not excise. I stopped sleeping. I survived on coffee and fear, my eyes bloodshot, my hands in a perpetual state of tremor. My work suffered. My friends called, their voices full of a concern that I could not answer without sounding like a raving lunatic. I was an island, and the waters were rising. The pictures began to change. They were no longer just of me. A photo appeared of Chloe walking down the street, her face a mask of worry. She was walking towards my apartment building. A few hours later, my buzzer rang. It was her. "Jacob, I've been calling you for a week," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and concern. "Are you okay? You look terrible." I couldn't let her in. I spoke to her through the intercom, my voice a ragged croak, telling her I had the flu, that I was fine, that she should go. The hurt in her eyes even through the tiny, distorted camera, was a physical blow. The camera wasn't just tormenting me, it was using the people I cared about to do it. It was isolating me, turning me into the monster they would all remember. And then the pictures began to show the future. It started with a photo of a broken plate on my kitchen floor, shattered into a dozen pieces. I spent the entire day in a state of high alert, refusing to go near my kitchen cabinets. That evening, as I was making coffee, a sudden, inexplicable tremor shook the building. A low, deep rumble from a passing construction truck on the street below. A plate vibrated off the shelf and shattered on the floor in the exact pattern as the photograph. My blood ran cold. The camera wasn't just a voyeur, it was an oracle, a prophet of mundane and perhaps not so mundane doom. It was showing me a script, a future that was already written, that I was powerless to change. My free will was an illusion. I was just an actor, hitting my marks in a horror movie written by a malevolent mechanical god. I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like a terminal cancer, that a final photograph was coming. The one that would explain everything, the one that would show me how it all ended. It appeared 3 nights ago. I developed it with the slow, resigned dread of a man walking to the gallows. The image that emerged from the developer was a culmination of all my fears, a perfect, monochrome distillation of the horror that had consumed my life. The perspective was my own. It was a photo taken from my point of view. My own hands were visible in the bottom of the frame, holding the Lixner camera. The camera was pointed down at the floor of my living room. Chloe was lying there, her eyes wide and staring at the ceiling, a dark, spreading stain on the front of her white blouse. In the corner of the frame, I could see the tip of my own shoe, and next to it, on the floor, was a knife. I stared at the photograph, a low, keening sound of pure despair escaping my lips. It wasn't going to just kill me. It was going to use me. It was going to turn me into a murderer. It was going to take the last person I had ever loved and make me destroy her. And it was going to document the act with its cold, passionless, quartz-infused eye. The final photograph wouldn't just be of a death, it would be my confession. I called her. My voice was a frantic, broken thing. Chloe, listen to me. Don't come here. Whatever you do, do not come to my apartment. I don't care what you hear. I don't care if I call you and beg. Stay away. Jacob, what's wrong? She cried. You're scaring me. Let me come over. Let me help you. No, I screamed, and I slammed the phone down. I threw it against the wall, shattering it. I had to break the chain of prophecy. For 2 days, I sat in my apartment, a prisoner of a future I was desperately trying to avoid. I boarded up the door with a hammer and nails. I sat on the floor in the dark, the Lixner in my lap, its cold weight a constant, terrible reminder. I waited. Last night I heard a pounding on my door. Jacob, it's me. The landlord let me into the building. I know you're in there. Please, just let me see you're okay. It was Chloe. My frantic, insane warnings had, of course, had the opposite effect. They had convinced her I was in danger and that she needed to save me. The prophecy was fulfilling itself. The final act was beginning. I could feel it then, a cold, alien sensation seeping into my arms, into my hands. The camera in my lap felt like it was humming, vibrating with a low, hungry energy. An impulse that was not my own told me to stand up, to go to the door, to let her in. I am writing this now, scrawling these words on the back of old photographic prints with a piece of charcoal from my art supplies, because I don't have much time. I can feel my will eroding, my own thoughts being drowned out by a cold, quiet, calculating intelligence that is not mine. It wants the picture. It has been building to this moment, to this perfect, tragic composition. Chloe is still outside my door. She's been talking to me for hours, her voice growing hoarse, pleading with me. And the other voice, the one inside my head, is getting stronger. It's telling me how beautiful the final print will be, the chiaroscuro of the shadows in the room, the tragic, poetic horror of the scene. It's a masterpiece, it tells me, the greatest photograph ever taken. The camera is in my hands now. It feels so heavy. My fingers are moving towards the nails I hammered into the door. I don't want to do it. I am screaming inside my own mind, a silent, unheard shriek. But my body is beginning to move. It's a slow, jerky, puppet-like motion, my muscles obeying a will that is not my own. The entity that lives in this camera, the ghost of Klaus Richter, or whatever ancient, hungry thing he woke up in that forest, it doesn't just capture moments. It creates them. It feeds on them. It feeds on despair. Chloe is calling my name, the name of the man I used to be. My hand is on the first nail. It's cold, sharp. I can see the final picture in my mind's eye, as clear as if it were already developed and hanging on a gallery wall. It is a work of undeniable soul-destroying art, and it will be my last testament. I don't know if I can stop it. I am raising the hammer. All I know is that the shutter is about to click. My GPS keeps directing me to the same abandoned house. The voice in my car is a woman named Cal. I don't know if that's her real name or even if she's a real woman. She speaks with the placid, uninflected calm of someone who has never been late, never been lost, and never felt the cold, creeping dread of being somewhere you are not supposed to be. Cal is the default voice of the Wayfinder 5000, a slightly outdated but relentlessly reliable GPS unit, suction-cupped to my windshield. For the past 6 years, as a regional sales manager for a mid-level pharmaceutical company, Cal has been my co-pilot, my navigator, my silent synthetic companion on the lonely asphalt veins of the American Midwest. She has never been wrong until she started trying to kill me, or if not kill me, then something far, far worse. The first time it happened, I was on my way to a meeting in rural Wisconsin. I was cutting through a stretch of farmland so flat and featureless, it felt like a screensaver. My appointment was in a town called Prairie Ridge, a place that barely registered as a smudge on the map. According to Cal, I was 40 minutes away. "In 200 feet, turn left," she said, her voice as serene as a mountain lake. I glanced at the screen. The purple line of my route took a sharp 90-degree turn off the main highway and onto a thin gray line that the map didn't even bother to name. "Recalculating," I said aloud, a habit I'd picked up over thousands of miles of solo driving. I tapped the screen, looking for an alternate route. There was none. This was it. I slowed the car and made the turn. The road was gravel, loose and chattering under my tires. Overgrown cornfields pressed in on both sides, their dry stalks rustling with a sound like whispering snakes. After about a mile, the road degraded further, becoming little more than 2 dirt tracks with a spine of weeds growing down the middle. My sensible company-issued sedan was not built for this. "Are you sure about this, Cal?" I muttered. "In 1,000 feet, Your destination will be on the right, she replied, oblivious to my concern. The cornfields fell away, and the trees began, ancient skeletal oaks that formed a dark, claustrophobic canopy over the road. And then I saw it. Set back from the road, half swallowed by a sea of thorny, overgrown bushes, was a house. It was an old farmhouse, the kind that might have been charming a century ago. Now it was a study in decay. The white paint had peeled away in long, leprous strips, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. The windows were dark, hollow eyes, most of them boarded up with mismatched planks. A single skeletal tree stood in the front yard, its dead branches reaching for the sky like the fingers of a drowning man. The place didn't just feel abandoned, it felt condemned, cursed. A deep, instinctual wrongness emanated from it, a silence that was heavier and more profound than the surrounding woods. "You have arrived at your destination," Cal announced cheerfully. I stopped the car, the engine a loud, intrusive rumble in the oppressive quiet. This was not Prairie Ridge. This was the middle of nowhere. A mapping error, a glitch in the satellite. I felt a surge of annoyance, mixed with a strange, inexplicable prickle of fear. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't want to breathe the air here. I just wanted to leave. I put the car in reverse and began the slow, careful process of backing down the narrow, rutted track. My eyes kept darting to the house in my rearview mirror. I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement in one of the dark upstairs windows, like a curtain being drawn aside. But there were no curtains. There was only splintered wood and darkness. By the time I got back to the highway and re-entered Prairie Ridge as my destination, I was an hour late for my meeting. I managed to salvage the sale with a flurry of apologies and a steep discount. I blamed the GPS, laughing it off as a piece of junk technology. But the image of that house was burned into my mind. The dead tree, the boarded-up windows, the feeling of being watched by something old and malevolent. 2 weeks later, I was in eastern Ohio, on my way to a conference, a different state, a different highway, hundreds of miles away. I was making good time, listening to a podcast, my mind on the quarterly report I had to file. "In 1/4 mile, take the exit on your right," Cal said. I glanced at the screen. The exit was for a state route that seemed to veer off into a large, green, unpopulated area on the map. My route should have kept me on the interstate for another 50 miles. "No, Cal," I said, sighing. "We're staying on the highway." I drove past the exit. Cal was silent for a moment. Then, "Recalculating. In 200 feet, turn left." She was trying to take me onto a small local road, a road that, according to the map, led nowhere. A cold, familiar dread began to bloom in my stomach. "Recalculate to avoid back roads," I said, my voice sharp. "Route recalculated," she replied. "In 1,000 feet, perform a U-turn where possible." For the next 10 minutes, we were locked in a battle of wills. Every route she suggested was a circuitous, nonsensical path that tried to steer me off the main road and into the rural unknown. She was like a horse that refused to be led, stubbornly trying to bolt for some unseen, familiar stable. Finally, in a fit of frustration, I unplugged the Wayfinder 5000 and threw it onto the passenger seat. I used my phone's mapping app for the rest of the trip. As I lay in my sterile, anonymous hotel room that night, I couldn't sleep. I picked up the Wayfinder and plugged it back in. The screen flickered to life. The map showed my current location, a little blue dot in the heart of the city. I opened the recent destinations list. At the very top of the list, it read, Crows End Road. I'd never heard the name before. I typed it into my phone's search engine. There were a few scattered results, none of them in Ohio, but one of them, a hit from a county plat map website, was in Wisconsin. It was an unmaintained dead-end road. My blood ran cold. It was the road to the abandoned house. The GPS hadn't just made a mistake. It had saved the location. It wanted to go back. The incidents grew more frequent and more insidious. Cal would be silent for hours, lulling me into a false sense of security. And then, at a crucial intersection, she would give a last-second incorrect instruction, trying to divert me. It became a constant low-level war. I began to hate the sound of her calm, pleasant voice. It was the voice of a saboteur, a traitor, in my own car. I bought a new GPS, a top-of-the-line model from a different brand. I boxed up the Wayfinder 5000 and put it in the trunk. I felt a sense of liberation as I programmed my first trip into the new device. The new voice was a man with a crisp British accent. It was a refreshing change. I was driving through Indiana on my way to see a client in Fort Wayne. The new GPS was working perfectly. In 1 mile, you will reach your destination, the British voice announced. And then a burst of static from the car's speakers. The new GPS screen flickered and went blank. A moment later, it came back on. But the map was different. It was a local, rural map. The British voice was gone. In 200 feet, turn left, said the calm, familiar, horrifying voice of Cal. I stared at the screen in disbelief. It was Cal's interface, her purple line, her familiar fonts. She had somehow overridden the new device. She had infected it. My car, my sanctuary, the one place where I was supposed to be in control, had been completely and utterly compromised. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. This was not a glitch. This was not a technological error. This was something else. This was an intelligence, a malevolent, focused intelligence that was fixated on one thing, getting me back to that house. That was when my life began to unravel. The fight was no longer just about directions. It was about my sanity. I became obsessed. I spent my nights in hotel rooms, not preparing for meetings, but scouring the internet, digging into the history of that small, forgotten plot of land in rural Wisconsin. The property on Crow's End Road, I discovered, had belonged to a family named the Whitakers. The last record of them was from a census of 1978. A husband, Silas, a wife, Mary, and a 6-year-old daughter named Lily. Then, in the fall of that same year, there was a fire. The official report, which I found in a digitized archive of the local newspaper, was brief and tragic. The fire had consumed the house. The cause was listed as undetermined. The bodies of Silas and Mary were found in the ashes. The daughter, Lily, was never found. She was presumed to have perished in the blaze, her small body consumed by the inferno. The article ended with a haunting single line from the fire chief at the time. It's a terrible tragedy. That house is at the end of a long, dark road. By the time we got the call and found our way out there, it was too late. There was nothing we could do. I stared at the grainy black and white photo that accompanied the article. It was the house, my house, but it was before the decay had set in. Before the boards were on the windows, it was just an ordinary, slightly ramshackle farmhouse, and on the porch, so small and out of focus that she was almost a ghost, was a little girl in a white dress holding a doll, Lily. The knowledge didn't bring me peace. It brought a deeper, colder dread. The house wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a tomb, a place of profound, unresolved tragedy. And for some reason, its ghost had latched onto my GPS. The haunting escalated. Cal began to speak to me even when the GPS was turned off. I'd be driving in silence, and her voice would suddenly emanate from the car's speakers, soft and clear. "Are you lost, Alan?" she'd ask. My name is Alan. I had never programmed my name into the device. The first time it happened, I almost drove off the road. I tore the GPS from the windshield, unplugged it, and threw it in the trunk, burying it under a suitcase. But her voice still came through the speakers. She was in the car's Bluetooth system, in its very wiring. She began to use details from my life. "Sarah is wondering when you will be home," she said one night as I was driving through a rainstorm. Sarah was my wife. "Emily has a piano recital on Friday. You shouldn't miss it." Emily was my 7-year-old daughter. The voice was using my own life, my love for my family, as a weapon against me, a way to anchor my fear, to make it more real. My work suffered. I missed meetings. I lost clients. I was constantly exhausted, living on a knife's edge of paranoia and fear. My boss put me on probation. I tried to explain, but how do you tell your boss that your car is haunted by a ghost who is obsessed with a tragic fire from the 1970s? My home life, my sanctuary, began to crumble. Sarah knew something was wrong. I was distant, jumpy, prone to long, silent stares out the window. I had lost weight. I had dark, bruised-looking circles under my eyes. "Alan, what is it?" she asked one night, her voice full of a worry that was beginning to curdle into frustration. "You're like a ghost. You're here, but you're not. Are you having an affair?" The question was so mundane, so normal, it was almost a relief. "No," I said, the word coming out as a choked, hollow sound. "God, no, it's the driving. I'm just burned out." It was a weak, pathetic lie, and we both knew it. The distance between us grew. A cold, silent canyon, carved out by a secret I couldn't share. How could I tell her that I was terrified to get in my car? That I had started taking rental cars to my meetings, only to have Cal's voice eventually bleed through their speakers, too. She was not tied to the device. She was tied to me. The dream started. I would be in the house. It was no longer abandoned, but filled with a thick, acrid smoke that stung my eyes and choked my lungs. I could hear a child crying, a thin, terrified wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I would try to find her, stumbling through the smoke-filled rooms, my hands outstretched, but the layout of the house would shift and change, a maddening architectural nightmare. I would always wake up just as I reached the door to the nursery, my hand on the hot brass knob, the sound of the girls weeping on the other side. I knew I was approaching a breaking point. I was losing my job, my wife, my mind. I was a man being haunted into oblivion. I had two choices. I could let it destroy me, or I could confront it. I had to go back to the house. I had to go to Crow's End Road, not as a lost, accidental tourist, but as a man looking for an answer. I had to understand why this was happening to me, why I had been chosen. I told Sarah I was going on a weekend sales retreat. Another lie to add to the growing pile. I got in my car. This time, I didn't fight it. I plugged in the Wayfinder 5000. Its screen cracked from one of my more violent attempts to silence it. "Navigate to last destination," I said, my voice a resigned, trembling whisper. "Navigating to Crow's End Road," Cal replied, her voice sounding for the very first time something like satisfied. The drive was 5 hours. Cal was silent the entire way, a quiet, expectant presence. As I turned off the highway and onto the familiar gravel road, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, blanketing the cornfields in a shroud of gray. The world grew silent, my car the only moving thing in a dead, quiet landscape. When I arrived, the house looked different. The decay was the same, but the wrongness I had felt before was now a palpable, physical presence. It was a low, humming vibration in the air, a pressure against my eardrums. It was the feeling of a place that was awake and waiting. I got out of the car. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else. Smoke. A faint, phantom smell of old, cold smoke. I walked up the rotten, sagging steps of the porch. The front door was ajar, hanging from a single rusted hinge. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was a wreck. Dust as thick and soft as gray snow covered everything. The furniture was draped in cobwebs that looked like funeral shrouds. In the center of the living room, there was a large, dark stain on the floorboards where the fire had burned hottest. My eyes were drawn to the staircase. It led up into a darkness that felt solid, absolute. The child's weeping from my dreams echoed in my memory. "Why am I here?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Are you lost, Alan?" The voice wasn't Cal's. It was in my head. A man's voice, rough and low like stones grinding together. I spun around. The room was empty. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice whispered in my mind. "This is my house. She is my daughter." A cold, creeping terror, far worse than anything I had felt before, began to seep into my bones. This was not the ghost of a lost little girl. This was something else. This was Silas, the father. I stumbled back, my hand finding the wall to steady myself. My fingers brushed against a patch of peeling wallpaper. Underneath it was a dark, almost black wood. The house had been charred from the inside out. The fire had been far worse than the newspaper had reported. I forced myself to move, to explore. I was an archaeologist in a tomb of sorrow. I found a kitchen, a rusted-out stove, a table with a single overturned chair. I found the master bedroom, a mattress with its springs bursting out like broken ribs. And then I found the nursery. The door was closed. The brass knob was cool to the touch. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was almost completely burned out. The walls were black with soot. The crib was a skeletal, charred frame. The air was thick with the smell of tragedy. But in the corner of the room, something had survived. It was a small wooden toy chest. The paint had been blistered by the heat, but it was largely intact. I knelt down and opened it. Inside, nestled among a few melted plastic toys, was a single leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and warped by the heat and the damp. The name Mary Whitaker was embossed on the cover. I opened it, my hands trembling. Mary's handwriting was a neat, elegant script, but as the entries progressed, they became a frantic, terrified scrawl. She wrote of her husband, Silas, of a good man who had been consumed by a darkness, a possessive, jealous rage. She wrote of his obsession with his daughter, Lily, an obsession that had soured into something unnatural, something terrifying. He wouldn't let her go to school. He wouldn't let her have friends. He saw every stranger as a threat. The final entry was dated the night of the fire. He has locked us in. He says the world is too full of poison, that he is the only one who can keep Lily pure. He has been talking to himself all day. I can smell gasoline. He is not going to let us leave. He is going to keep us here with him forever. If anyone ever finds this, know that I tried to save my daughter. Know that I loved her. A single hot tear dripped onto the fragile page. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a murder-suicide. Silas had been a monster. He had trapped his family, and when he couldn't control them in life, he had bound them to this place in death. But that didn't explain me. It didn't explain the GPS. I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing but the feeling of being watched, of Silas's malevolent presence, was suffocating. I had to get out. I stumbled out of the nursery, clutching the diary, and ran for the stairs. As I reached the bottom step, I saw it. On a small, dusty table by the front door, half hidden under a pile of rotted mail, was an object that had no business being there. It was a Wayfinder 5000 GPS unit, the exact same model as mine. Its screen was cracked, and it was caked in dust and grime, but it was unmistakable. And then the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My GPS wasn't haunted by a ghost from the house. My GPS was from the house. Silas Whitaker, a traveling salesman, perhaps, like me. A man who relied on a piece of technology to guide him. A man who had programmed his home address into the device. A single, final destination. On that last, terrible night, as he drove home with his can of gasoline and his murderous intent, that GPS had been in his car, charting his final fatal course. The device had absorbed the trauma, the rage, the violent possessive energy of that night. It had become a vessel for his will. It was a cursed object, a relic of a murder. And somehow, through the strange, convoluted currents of second-hand sales and forgotten electronics, it had found its way to me. Or, more terrifyingly, it had chosen me. A man just like him, a traveling father with a wife and a daughter at home. It was trying to repeat the pattern. It was trying to bring me home, to its home, to make me a part of its endless tragic loop. You can stay, the voice of Silas whispered in my head. We can be a family. I heard the front door slam shut with a deafening final boom. The air grew cold. The shadows in the room deepened and seemed to coalesce. A figure began to form in the doorway, a tall, gaunt man made of smoke and rage and decades of festering hate. But another presence was in the room now, too, a small, cold spot by the foot of the stairs. I could hear a faint, sobbing sound. It was her, Lily. She wasn't a part of his rage. She was his victim, his prisoner. And she was just as trapped as he was. I knew then what I had to do. I couldn't fight him. He was too strong here. This was his house. But maybe I could free her. The GPS. It was a beacon for him, but maybe it could be a key for her. It was a map. It knew the way home, but it was stuck on its final terrible instruction. I had to give it a new one. I ran back to my car, the ghost of Silas shrieking with rage behind me, the force of his anger a physical battering wind. I fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with sweat. I got in the car and slammed the door, locking it. The windows began to frost over from the inside. A child's small spectral handprint appeared on the passenger side glass. I ripped my own wayfinder from the dashboard. I looked at the little girl's handprint. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm going to take you home. Not this home, a different one." My fingers flew across the screen of the GPS. I went into the settings, into the saved addresses. Under Home, it listed the coordinates for Crow's End Road. I deleted it. Then I typed in a new address. My address. The address where my wife and daughter were waiting. The address that, for the past few months, I had been too terrified to even think about. "Set destination to home," I said, my voice firm. The screen flickered. The ghost of Silas roared, and the car shook violently, as if in the grip of a giant, unseen hand. For a moment, the map showed the twisted, impossible route back to the farmhouse. But then something shifted. A new, clean, purple line appeared on the screen, leading away from this place of horror, leading back towards the highway, back towards the world of the living. "Navigating to home," Cal said. Her voice was different. The cold, synthetic edge was gone. It was just a voice now, a tool. The curse had been broken. The pressure on the car vanished. The frost on the windows melted away. The small, spectral handprint faded. I looked in my rearview mirror. The house on Crow's End Road was just a house again, a sad, rotting structure in a dying wood. The profound, malevolent wrongness was gone. I had not defeated the ghost of Silas Whitaker. I had simply taken away his map. I had stolen his ride. I drove away from that place and didn't look back. The 5-hour drive home was the quietest, most peaceful drive of my life. I threw the Wayfinder 5000 into a gas station trash can 100 miles away. When I walked through my front door, the smell of Sarah's cooking, the sound of Emily practicing a clumsy, beautiful song on the piano, it was the most sacred, wonderful sensory experience of my life. I held them both, my face buried in their hair, and I wept. They didn't understand why, not really, and I would never be able to tell them. I quit my job. I found a new one, a local one. I don't drive much anymore. My world has become smaller and infinitely more precious. I am a man who has looked into the abyss, a place where love becomes a cage and home becomes a tomb. I am a man who was chosen by a ghost to be his replacement. But I refused the role. I rewrote the map. I chose my own destination, and every morning, when I wake up in my own bed next to my wife, with the sound of my daughter padding down the hall, I know, with a gratitude that is as deep and as real as a prayer, that I have arrived. I am home. I found a hidden room behind my mirror. Someone was living there. I inherited the apartment from my great-aunt Beatrice, a woman whose life had been a meticulous study in quiet routine right up until the point where she wasn't quiet anymore. It was a pre-war brownstone unit, 3 floors up, with impossibly high ceilings, crown molding that looked like carved icing, and a labyrinthine heating system that hissed and groaned like a sleeping dragon. The whole place smelled faintly of mothballs and old dry paper, and while it was beautiful, it was undeniably old, full of architectural secrets and the kind of strange permanent shadows that modern lighting couldn't seem to dispel. I moved in because the rent was non-existent, and because I, too, enjoyed the quiet routine that the building seemed to enforce. The apartment's master bathroom was particularly strange. It was large and overly ornate for a bathroom, featuring a clawfoot tub and a massive, antique-looking mirror that dominated the entire wall above the pedestal sink. The mirror was huge, framed in dark, heavy carved oak, and it was bolted directly into the plaster. It wasn't the kind of mirror you could simply lift and move. It felt like a fixture, a permanent portal in the room's history. I tried to clean it, but the glass had an inherent subtle distortion, a kind of rippling imperfection that made my reflection seem slightly warped, stretched, or sometimes just out of sync with my movements. I put it down to the age of the glass and the silver backing, but I always felt an unpleasant chill when I stood too close to it, a strange, localized cold spot that lingered no matter how high I cranked the radiator. It was that cold spot that first became a nuisance and then a horrifying clue. I am a meticulous person, a creature of habit and order, and I hate inefficiency. The draft, or whatever it was wasting my heat. I started my investigation with a thermal gun, the kind used for home energy audits. The plaster wall around the mirror registered a consistent 72 degrees, the room temperature. But the exact center of the mirror, the focal point where my reflection's face usually was, registered a baffling 58 degrees. It was a localized, persistent cold, not a draft, but a chill coming from inside the wall. Intrigued, I tapped the glass. The sound was solid near the edges, a heavy, dull thud of glass against plaster. But as I moved my knuckles toward the cold spot, the thud changed. It became hollower, lighter, an echoing, unsettling tap, tap, tap that suggested a significant, unsupported cavity behind the frame. I ran my hand over the oak frame, feeling for a hinge or a latch, but the thing was bolted down with iron screws that had been painted over and sealed with layers of glossy enamel. I decided I had to see what was back there. It was likely a bricked-up chimney flue, a long-forgotten service shaft, or maybe just a clumsy repair job. I told myself it was for the sake of energy efficiency. It took me 3 hours with a screwdriver, a utility knife, and a lot of swearing to chip away the paint and pry the decorative molding off the mirror's frame. The frame itself was held in place by 4 enormous heavy-gauge bolts sunk deep into the wall. As I loosened the last one, the massive mirror gave a shudder and pitched forward an inch, revealing a shocking amount of dust and grime and a thin, dark line of shadow between the frame and the wall. I slowly, carefully, lowered the mirror onto the bathroom floor, the glass reflecting the ceiling and the frantic, pale image of my own face. What was revealed was not a bricked-up flue, but an archway. It was a small, crudely cut opening in the plaster and lath, roughly the size of a man's torso, almost perfectly centered where the cold spot had been. The edges of the opening were ragged, showing the inner structure of the wall, but there was no plaster dust on the floor below it. That meant the opening had been there for a long time. The biggest shock, however, was what the opening led to. It didn't lead to darkness or a void or the back of a chimney. It led to a space that was clearly a room. I shone the flashlight of my phone into the cavity. It wasn't a standard crawl space. It was a narrow, elongated room, maybe 6 feet wide and 15 feet long, running parallel to the bathroom wall and extending into the dead space between my apartment and the building's main staircase, or maybe another unit. The walls were unfinished brick, and the floor was covered in a layer of old, fine, metallic-smelling dust, the kind that accumulates in forgotten, unventilated spaces. But a dust had been disturbed. There was a clear, swept pathway leading from the opening deeper into the dark. And then I saw the objects. The first thing I registered was a sleeping cot, a simple canvas military-style bed positioned in the furthest corner. It was neatly made, but the pillow was dented, the blanket slightly rumpled, a clear sign of recent use. Next to the cot, there was a makeshift shelf fashioned from a piece of old wood placed atop 2 stacked bricks, and on that shelf a few personal items: a small tarnished silver cup, a worn, paper-covered book that I couldn't make out the title of, and next to the shelf, tucked discreetly against the wall, a 5-gallon plastic bucket, presumably for sanitary purposes. But the detail that locked the horror in my throat, freezing the air in my lungs, was the tray. Placed near the opening, directly facing where the mirror had been, was a small silver-rimmed tea tray. On it sat a ceramic plate with half a tuna salad sandwich, neatly cut and covered with a piece of plastic wrap. It wasn't moldy. The bread hadn't gone stale. It had been left there at most a few hours prior. Someone was living here. Someone had been living here today. I took a step back, the phone slipping in my sweaty hand. The person who lived here was not a vagrant who had broken in. This room was an architectural anomaly, a permanent hidden space accessed through a secret hole in my wall, a hole that was covered by a massive, centuries-old mirror. The occupant had to have known the architecture, had to have a key, or an incredible talent for stealth. Then my eyes snapped back to the opening, and specifically to the inner side of the mirror frame that was now resting on my floor. I ran my fingers over the glass. On the side that had faced the wall where the archway was, there was a patch of clear, pristine glass about the size of a small window pane. The rest of the backing was opaque and silvery, but this one section had been chemically stripped, replaced by a specialized translucent film. It wasn't a mirror on that side at all. It was a cleverly disguised one-way window. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a rush of nausea that made the already close air of the bathroom feel suffocating. I hadn't just been looking at my reflection for the past 2 months. I had been observed. Every morning, shaving, brushing my teeth, staring into the glass, I hadn't been alone. The person inside had been watching me, their cot positioned perfectly so that my face, my routine, the minutiae of my solitary life were their entertainment, their window to the outside world. The slight distortion I had always complained about was the result of the crude one-way film, not the age of the glass. The cold spot was their breathing, their body temperature, their proximity to the pain. I scrambled out of the bathroom, shutting the door and locking it with a desperate, frantic click of the cheap brass bolt. I called the police. When they arrived, they were skeptical. They were thorough, though, and they crawled into the space. They found the cot, the bucket, the shelf. But the sandwich was gone. The plate was empty, wiped clean. The book was closed and pushed further back on the shelf. The police found no finger-printable surfaces, no documents, no evidence of a crime beyond trespassing. They theorized it was a transient, a squatter who knew the old building's layout, who had been hiding there, and who had fled when I started removing the mirror. They taped off the area, filed a report that mentioned a likely unhoused individual, and left. I knew they didn't believe the part about the one-way mirror. suggesting I was overreacting due to the shock. I didn't replace the mirror. I couldn't. Instead, I boarded up the archway with 2x4s and several layers of drywall, sealing the opening with a thick coat of plaster, the smell of which was meant to replace the metallic dust I had smelled. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the person had fled the building, but the knowledge of the hidden room had irrevocably altered my reality. That's when the sounds began. They weren't coming from the sealed-up mirror room, or at least not only from there. They came from the walls, not the loud, familiar creaks of an old building settling, but soft, dry, insidious noises. A faint, rhythmic scrabbling like fingernails on dusty plaster, or the movement of a tiny animal, but too controlled, too deliberate to be a mouse. A soft, measured thump-tap slide, a sound that seemed to be traveling in the dead spaces between the joists, the service shafts, and the vertical pipes of the ancient heating system. I would be reading in my living room, and the sound would be directly behind the bookcase. I would be in my kitchen, and it would seem to emanate from the space between the cupboard and a wall. I realized the mirror room wasn't the person's only space. It was their observatory. Their home was the entire forgotten, hidden infrastructure of the building, a complex, dark network of architectural dead space that was only accessible to someone impossibly small, flexible, and utterly silent. They were living in the negative space of the brownstone like a parasite in the host's body, and my apartment was merely one visible surface of their sprawling, invisible habitat. The terror became an exquisite, personalized form of psychological torture. My things would be subtly moved. I would leave my wallet on the hall table and later find it pushed half an inch further toward the wall. I'd be certain I'd close the window latch before leaving for work, only to find it slightly ajar when I returned. One evening I reached for my toothbrush and noticed it was distinctly wet when I knew I hadn't used it for hours. These were not the signs of a burglar or a vandal. They were the signs of an intimate observer, someone who had learned my habits so well they could use the briefest moments of my absence to slip out, move freely, and then retreat back into the silent, dusty labyrinth. The ultimate psychological attack came one night when I was asleep. I woke up suddenly with that visceral jolt of someone watching you. The room was black, silent, the kind of absolute darkness that presses down on your eyelids. I held my breath, listening, the frantic hammering of my own heart deafening in my ears. And then I heard it, a soft, dry, almost papery cough that came from the wall directly behind my headboard. It was the cough of a person, but one whose lungs were choked with old dust and the dry air of unventilated space. It was right there. I shot out of bed, slammed on the light, and stared at the beige, innocuous wall. Nothing. No vent, no crack, no seam. Just the solid, painted plaster. I stopped trying to escape the reality. I accepted terrible truth. I was sharing my life with an elegant, silent shadow, a forgotten dweller of the city's unseen spaces who used my apartment as a source of warmth and human observation. I went to the sealed-up bathroom. The freshly plastered archway looked solid, but I could hear a faint, high-pitched, scritching sound coming from within the wall. I grabbed a Sharpie and a piece of paper, and I taped the note to the newly painted wall directly over where the one-way mirror had been. The words were a mix of desperation and challenge. Who are you? Please, stop. Why are you here? You need help?" The next morning, the note was gone. The tape was still there, a pale frame around nothing. In its place, stuck to the plaster with a tiny, nearly invisible dab of what looked like dried mud, was a small, meticulously folded piece of paper, no bigger than a matchbook. I had to use tweezers to retrieve it. The handwriting was thin, elegant, almost spider-like, a script from a forgotten century, yet completely legible. The message was 3 chilling, impossible words. "I am your silent twin. You are too loud." The insult wasn't just in the words. It was in the revelation that my life, my quiet life, was an intolerable racket to this person. My movements, my breathing, the sound of my television, the scraping of my chair, all of it was a cacophony disrupting their perfect, absolute silence. I knew I had to see them. I had to know what kind of human being could exist in such a space. I had to face my silent twin. That night, I waited. I set up my phone on a tripod with the flash off, recording video, and I sat on the floor of the bathroom, a blanket wrapped around me, a heavy wrench lying uselessly beside me. The main lights were off, the only illumination coming from the thin sliver of light beneath the door. Hours passed. The building settled. The heating system finally fell silent. I was a man of routine, and my routine was to sleep. Despite the fear, despite the adrenaline, my body betrayed me. I slumped against the wall, and exhaustion, my old enemy, finally claimed me. I woke with a jolt. The air in the room was suddenly, drastically colder. I hadn't heard a sound. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking, and looked at the time. 3:17 a.m. I had been asleep for maybe 20 minutes. I stared at the sealed archway, expecting to see a fresh hole, but the plaster was intact. The scrabbling sound, however, was back, and it was loud, no longer behind the plaster, but right next to me. I realized the sound was coming from the air vent near the floor, the old cast-iron grill on the baseboard that fed the heating system. I spun around, wrench in hand, and focused the dim light of the phone screen on the vent. It wasn't just a sound. The vent cover was slightly ajar, tilted outward at a small, impossible angle, and from the thin black gap created by that angle, something was moving. It was a person, impossibly thin, dressed in layers of old dusty gray fabric that seemed to blend perfectly with the shadows and the dirty plaster. Their face was a pale, wedge-shaped mask, their hair matted with dust, but their eyes were the thing that held me. They were huge, dinner plate-sized, dilated to absolute blackness, reflecting the pinprick of my phone light like twin black mirrors. They were the eyes of a creature accustomed to near absolute, perpetual darkness, eyes that found my faint illumination blinding. They were not menacing. They were terrified. They froze, seeing me, the light, the weapon. For a single, terrifying second, our lives intersected, the man of the light, the man of the dark. And then, with an impossible fluidity, a speed that defied the limits of the human skeleton, the creature slid backward, not running, but smoothly retreating, pulling their thin, dusty body through the narrow ventilation grill. I heard the sound of dry, brittle bones flexing and the rustle of old cloth. The cast-iron grill, which was heavy and usually required a screwdriver to move, pulled itself shut with a soft, decisive click. I sat there for an hour, the light blazing, the wrench still in my hand, staring at the perfectly closed vent. I knew I couldn't report this. I knew the police would institutionalize me. I knew I was not safe. I moved out the next day. I left the furniture, the keys, everything. I moved to a sleek, modern glass and steel apartment tower, a sterile world of new construction where there are no hidden spaces, no old service shafts, no architectural dead zones for a shadow dweller to hide. I live on the 22nd floor, surrounded by sealed walls and new HVAC systems. But I am not free. Every rhythmic thrum of the building's central air conditioning sends a cold wave of panic through me. Every shadow cast by the city lights at night seems to hold a shape that is impossibly thin. I jump at the sound of the elevator moving in the wall, and 1 month ago, a letter was forwarded to my new address from the old brownstone. It was a standard-sized envelope, the paper smelling faintly of ozone and old metallic dust. Inside, there was a single, meticulously folded piece of paper, the same spider-like script. I miss the quiet routine of your sleep. The new walls are too thin. You are still too loud. My terror is now complete. He is not in the walls of the brownstone anymore. He is not a squatter. He is a predator, or perhaps a shadow twin, and he has been following me. He has learned my quiet routine, and I know that somewhere in the dead space between the insulation, the vents, and the concrete of my new modern high-rise, there is a pair of black, dilated eyes watching me, waiting for me to be still enough, quiet enough, for him to slip out and finally introduce himself. And I know with crushing certainty that I will never be truly alone again. I streamed myself sleeping. Someone knocked on my door while I was watching. The idea was born, as most of my bad ideas are, from a potent cocktail of boredom, narcissism, and the relentless gnawing need for content. My name is Ethan, and for the past 3 years, I've been a mid-level streamer on a platform that rewards consistency over quality. My niche, if you could call it that, was ambient horror. I'd play obscure, atmospheric horror games, narrate creepypastas in a low, sonorous voice, or simply host long, quiet streams from my dimly lit apartment, allowing the natural, unsettling sounds of my pre-war building to become the star of the show. My audience was small but loyal, a collection of fellow insomniacs and weirdos who found a strange communal comfort in our shared digital loneliness. The concept was deceptively simple: a 24/7, uninterrupted live stream of me sleeping. I called it the Somnus Project. The tagline I came up with was, "What happens when we're not watching?" It was a nod to the paranormal, a wink to my horror-loving audience, but in reality, it was a gimmick, a high-concept, low-effort way to keep my channel active, to hoover up a few extra donations while I was literally unconscious. Setting it up was easy. I mounted a wide-angle, night vision-capable webcam on a tripod in the corner of my bedroom, positioning it to capture my bed and most of the room. I set up a dedicated laptop to handle the stream, its screen a glowing, hypnotic eye in the darkness. On the first night, I went through my usual pre-stream ritual, talking to the chat, which was buzzing with a mixture of curiosity and mockery. "Bro is literally gonna get paid to sleep," one user typed. "What if he snores?" another asked. "Hope a ghost shows up, LOL," wrote a third. I laughed it off, signed off with my usual, "Stay safe in the shadows," and went to bed. I fell asleep to the quiet hum of the laptop and the knowledge that a few hundred strangers were watching me drool on my pillow. It was a profoundly weird, quintessentially 21st century feeling. The first few days were a bust, paranormal-wise. I snored, I tossed and turned. I once mumbled something about a missing spreadsheet in my sleep. The stream was, as expected, mind-numbingly boring, but my viewership numbers were up. People would leave the stream on in the background, a kind of bizarre human white noise machine. The donations trickled in, small amounts with messages like, "For your electric bill, Sleep King," or "Hope you're having sweet dreams." It was working. I would spend my waking hours in my living room, which doubled as my office, editing videos, answering emails, and, of course, watching the stream. It was a strange, out-of-body experience to be sitting on my sofa, drinking coffee, while simultaneously watching a live feed of my own empty, unmade bed. The bedroom door was always visible in the shot. It was a heavy, solid oak door, and I had a habit of closing it firmly every night. The first anomaly occurred on the fourth night. I was up late reviewing the VOD, video on demand, from the previous night, looking for any highlights I could clip for social media. A particularly loud snore, a funny sleep mumble. I was fast-forwarding through the long, static hours of darkness when I saw it. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the bedroom door, which I had distinctly remembered closing, slowly, silently, crept open. I stopped the playback, my heart giving a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I rewound it and watched again, in real time. The movement was almost imperceptible. A thin black sliver appeared between the door and the frame, widening by a millimeter every few seconds, until the door was opened by a good 6 inches. There was no sound, no creak of hinges. It was like the door was made of smoke. It stayed open for the rest of the night. My blood ran cold. My building was old, the floors uneven. It was possible, I told myself, that the door hadn't been properly latched and had swung open on its own. A draft, perhaps. It was a rational, logical explanation, and I clung to it like a life raft. But I had never known that door to swing open on its own before. It was a heavy, well-fitted door. That night, before I went to bed, I made a point of not just closing the door, but locking it. I even gave the knob a hard jiggle on camera for the chat to see. "Just making sure we don't have any drafts tonight, guys," I said with a nervous laugh. I watched the VOD the next day. The door had stayed closed. I felt a wave of relief, followed by a pang of disappointment. A small, content, hungry part of me had been hoping for a ghost. But the next night, something else happened. Something I couldn't explain away with drafts or uneven floors. I was watching the VOD from the night before. At 2:47 a.m., one of the books on my bedside table, a heavy hardback copy of House of Leaves, slid off the table and fell to the floor with a soft, muffled thud. I hadn't even noticed it when I woke up. I had just picked it up and put it back without a second thought. But watching it on the replay, it was unnerving. It didn't just tip over, it slid, as if pushed by an invisible hand, moving a good 2 inches horizontally before it fell. The chat, which was watching the VOD along with me, went wild. "You WTIF, was that? Okay, that's not a draft. Demon, confirmed." I was skeptical, but I was also a streamer. I knew content when I saw it. I clipped the video of the fallen book and the opening door and posted them online. The clips got more views than anything I had ever produced. My follower count started to climb. I was no longer just the Sleep King. I was the guy with the haunted apartment. The phenomena grew in intensity, but they were always subtle, always deniable, a shadow that would move in a way that didn't match any light source, a soft, whispering sound that was barely audible on the microphone, a sound I always dismissed as audio. Artifacting. My alarm clock, a digital one, would sometimes be set to a different time when I woke up, always just a few minutes off. I was living a strange, bifurcated life. During the day, I was the excited, slightly spooked host, analyzing the footage with my growing audience, speculating about ghosts and poltergeists. But at night, when I had to actually go into that room and sleep, a real gnawing fear began to take root. The room felt different. The air was heavier, colder. I felt like I was sleeping on a stage, not just for my viewers, but for an unseen, silent audience that was already in the room with me. I started talking to it, not on stream, but in the quiet of the room before I went to bed. "If you're here," I'd whisper into the darkness, "give me a sign, a real one." It was a stupid, horror movie trope thing to do, but I couldn't help myself. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught between the performance of being haunted and the terrifying possibility that it was real. The real sign came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks into the Somnus Project. It was one of the rare nights I decided not to review the VOD from the night before. I had been out with friends, a brief, desperate foray into the normal world. I came home late, exhausted. I glanced at the stream on my phone. My bed was empty, the room silent. I went to bed, closed and locked the door, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling watched. It was a palpable, physical sensation, like the feeling of static electricity on your skin. I sat up in bed. Everything seemed normal. The door was still closed. The books were on the table, but the air was thick with a kind of resonant, humming silence. I went into the living room and pulled up the stream on my main monitor. I wasn't going to review the whole VOD. I was just going to check on something. A new paranoid ritual I had developed. I would check the moment I got into bed and the moment I woke up, just to make sure no time was missing, that there were no gaps in the recording. I scrubbed the timeline back to the moment I had entered the room last night. There I was, walking into frame, getting into bed, pulling up the covers. Everything was normal. Then I scrubbed forward to this morning, to the moment I had woken up. I watched myself sit up, look around, and then get out of bed. Normal. But something was nagging at me, a sliver of unease. I decided to watch the whole night. On 2x speed, the hours flew by in a blur of me tossing and turning in the ghostly green-tinged glow of the night vision. The digital clock in the corner of the stream ticked by. 2 hours a.m., 3 hours a.m., 4 hours a.m. Nothing. And then, at 4:22 a.m., it happened. My sleeping form on the bed suddenly went rigid. Not the kind of stiffness from a bad dream, but an unnatural, board-like rigidity. And then my body began to levitate. I stared at the screen, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. It was not a hoax. It was not a trick of the camera. My body, my sleeping, unconscious body, was lifted a good foot off the mattress, held there for nearly 30 seconds by an unseen force, and then gently, slowly, lowered back down. There were no wires. There was no one else in the room. I just floated. My coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the floor. I didn't even flinch. I just kept staring at the screen, at the impossible, undeniable evidence of what had happened in my room while I slept. The whispers, the moving objects. They weren't prelude. They were the opening act. This was the main event. I replayed the clip a dozen times. My mind, a frantic, drowning thing, tried to find a rational explanation, a dream, a hallucination. But I wasn't asleep when I was watching this. This was a recording. It was real. The thing in my apartment wasn't just moving my books, it was moving me. My first impulse was to end the stream, to pack a bag and leave, to burn the apartment to the ground. But the second impulse, the one that had been conditioned by years of chasing views and engagement, was different. This was the Holy Grail. This was the kind of footage that could make a career. This was the ghost I had been hoping for, even though its reality was 1,000 times more terrifying than I had ever imagined. Against every instinct of self-preservation I possessed, I clipped the levitation video. I posted it to my social media with a single, trembling, all-caps caption. I need help. This is not a joke. My channel exploded. The clip went viral, ricocheting across the internet. It was debated on Reddit, analyzed on YouTube, and even picked up by a few mainstream paranormal news sites. My viewer count skyrocketed from a few hundred to tens of thousands. I was no longer a mid-level streamer. I was a global phenomenon. I was the levitating man. The world was divided. Half believed it was one of the most convincing pieces of paranormal evidence ever captured. The other half believed I was a master hoaxer, a digital magician who had somehow pulled off the perfect illusion. The debate only fueled the fire. I was a prisoner in my own home. I was too terrified to sleep in the bedroom, but I was also too terrified to end the stream. I had created a monster, and now I had to keep feeding it. I started sleeping on the sofa in the living room, leaving the bedroom empty, a stage for whatever entity had taken up residence there, and the activity increased. Now that it had an audience, it began to perform. The door would be thrown open with violent force. The books would fly off the shelves. One night, the word "get" was scrawled on a wall in what looked like ash or soot. The next night, the word "out" appeared beside it. My life became a 24/7 horror show, and I was both the star and the sole terrified audience member in the front row. My mental state was disintegrating. I was a raw nerve, jumping at every shadow, my hands in a perpetual shaky tremor. The money was pouring in, but I couldn't spend it. The fame was suffocating. I was the ringmaster of a circus I could not control. And then came last night. I had been awake for nearly 48 hours, surviving on caffeine and raw fear. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, not even on the sofa. I was sitting in my computer chair, the warm glow of the monitor, my only companion, watching the live feed from the bedroom. The chat was a frantic, scrolling waterfall of text, thousands of people from all over the world watching the empty, haunted room with me. For hours, there was nothing, just the quiet, malevolent stillness of the room. The "get out" on the wall seemed to pulse in the night vision. And then, at 3:13 a.m., the same time the door had first opened a lifetime ago, a new phenomenon began. A knock. A soft, hesitant, 3-beat knock. Knock, knock, knock. It was not coming from the bedroom. It was coming from my front door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. My neighbors were a quiet, elderly couple who were in bed by 9. No one ever knocked on my door this late. The chat exploded. Did anyone else hear that? Someone's at the door. Don't answer it, Ethan. I stared at the monitor, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It's probably a neighbor, I typed into the chat, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. Loud music or something? But I knew it was a lie. My apartment was silent. And then I looked at the live stream feed from my bedroom, and what I saw made the world dissolve into a roaring, static-filled void in my ears. On the screen, in the live real-time feed of my bedroom, a figure was standing. It was a tall, thin silhouette, featureless and black, standing in the center of the room where there had been nothing but empty air a second before. It was not a shadow. It had depth, dimension. It was a hole in the shape of a man, a void that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. It was perfectly still, and it was facing the camera. I couldn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a hard, painful knot of pure, undiluted terror. The thing on my screen was not a ghost. It was not a poltergeist. It was something else, something that had been drawn to the attention, to the energy of thousands of people, all focused on this one small room. I had not just opened a door for a ghost. I had opened a portal, and something had stepped through. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking at my front door was louder now, a frantic, angry pounding. It was in sync with the pulsing of the blood in my ears. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monitor. The figure in the bedroom slowly lifted an arm. Its hand was a blur of static, but it was pointed directly at the camera, pointed at me. And then the voice. It wasn't in the room. It wasn't on the stream. It was inside my head. A dry, rasping, impossibly ancient sound like the crumbling of a tombstone. You opened the door. Now let me in. The knocking on my front door was no longer a knock. It was a violent, splintering crash, as if someone was throwing their entire body against a wood. The heavy, solid oak was groaning, the frame vibrating. My mind finally broke free from its paralysis. I scrambled back from my desk, my chair tipping over and crashing to the floor. I looked wildly around my living room, my sanctuary, which now felt like a death trap. The bedroom was compromised. The front door was about to give way. I am writing this now frantically on my phone, huddled in the one place I have left to hide, the small windowless bathroom. I have barricaded the door with a laundry hamper, a pathetic, flimsy defense against the impossible. The pounding on the front door has stopped, but the silence that followed is so much worse. I can hear footsteps, soft, dragging footsteps just outside the bathroom door, and a low, whispering sound, a sibilant, multi-toned whisper that seems to be coming from all directions at once. It's the sound from the stream, the sound I had dismissed as an audio glitch. It is not a glitch. It is the sound of its voice. My phone is my only light. I have the live stream of my bedroom still open on the screen. The figure is gone. The room is empty again. But that's not a comfort. It just means it's no longer in there. It's out here with me. The doorknob of the bathroom is turning. Slowly, silently, I am watching it happen. My own reflection, a pale, terrified ghost in the dark screen of my phone. My Somnus project was a success. I asked the question, what happens when we're not watching? And I got the answer. Something wakes up, and it watches you back. And then it comes to visit. I created a viral sensation. I have millions of viewers now, but the content is no longer mine to control. The show is being run by my new silent partner. I am the final act. The lock on the door just clicked. The whispering is getting louder. I think I know what the final clip is going to be.